So first of all, obviously, to welcome you all. And I'm Gudla Weiss-Sussex. I'm a reader in German studies at the AMLUK. But my welcome is on the part of the AMLUK, but also from AMLUK. And let me just say a few words about AMLUK, because not everyone may be aware of what they do. So AMLUK is the Alliance of Modern Languages, Area Studies and Linguistics Subject Associations in the UK. And it was set up 6 years ago as an association to bring together these very closely related fields to share information and develop strategies. And since last April, the collaboration was stepped up in the sense that AMLUK was established as a special interest group at UCML. It's administered by the AMLUK. Charles Burdett, who is the AMLUK director, chairs AMLUK. And this designation of AMLUK as a UCML special interest group really provided an impetus to step things up and to intensify the collaboration. And Charles Forstick and Janice Carruthers suggested that there should be annual workshops, annual symposia, to get people talking and really make sure that there's an ongoing conversation and not just this loose alliance of people who come together and share information. And this suggestion obviously was taken up, and what you see here is the inaugural symposium in this series. And behind it is a desire to coordinate better, to learn from one another, a desire to overcome fragmentation, and really to do away with the barriers between our fields. We recognize that in order to effectively feed into current movements, such as decolonizing and decentering the curriculum, but also movements towards interdisciplinarity, stronger and more collaborative thinking is necessary. So partly this collaboration, and this workshop is part of it, is also due to a recognition of how crucial this joined up thinking is politically, and especially now. In our post-Erasmus and post-Brexit world, it seems often that institutional and wider societal forces are not exactly encouraging international and transnational outlooks. So we have to be all the more stronger and to speak with one voice. Right. So this is the context, but our focus today is on pedagogies. One of our greatest concerns currently is to engage and support the next generation of students. And again, in the context that we live in today, it is really all the more important that we help students see the benefits of intercultural inquiry, and that we help them to experience this intercultural inquiry, and to enable them to carry them out in a critical and self-directed way. So pedagogies, therefore, is at the center of what we need to be thinking about. It's a good topic for discussion for our first AMLUK symposium. The program, you've all seen it, is looking at the link between research and pedagogy. It's looking at relating teaching and student learning to the world outside the classroom, and also to explore the link between university and school level education. But crucially, I think that's the most important thing, crucially, today's discussion is an opportunity to think about pedagogy in the context of cross-disciplinary broadening and enrichment. So you've seen the panels are organized into area studies, linguistics, and literary film studies, but the respondents come from a different area of expertise. That is deliberate, of course. They will be offering their perspectives, ensuring cross-engagement and kicking off the discussions. So the organization of the symposium. Papers are supposed to be very short, just impetus for and impulses for discussion. There will be no longer than 10 minutes, followed by a short response, and then general discussion. If I could all ask you to stay muted, but do please take part in the discussion by posting your question and your remarks in the chat function, and the chair will then pick up your question and feed them in. I think that's all that needs to be said in terms of organization. So I very much look forward to today's discussion. And I'll hand over now to my colleague Joe Ford, who is chairing the first panel.
Thank you very much, Gudula, for that introduction. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Ford. I'm a lecturer in French Studies at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, and I'm chairing this first session. I've got the pleasure of chairing this first session today, which is entitled Area Studies. We've got three fantastic speakers, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural AMLUK Symposium. Given we're fairly tight on time today, I'm going to go right ahead and introduce our speakers. Just to reconfirm what Gordla says, they'll speak for 10 minutes each. Then I'll invite our respondent to respond for 5 minutes before opening to questions from the audience. And you're very welcome to post questions in the chat. So our first speaker today is Claire Griffiths, and Claire was for many years head of modern languages and university chair in area studies at Chester University. Claire specialises in francophone political, cultural and gender studies with particular reference to sub-Saharan, West and Central Africa. And Claire's title today is From Interdisciplinary to Decolonial, Area Studies as a Site of Experimentation in Territorial and Disciplinary Boundary Shifting. Claire, I'll hand right over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Let's just get the screen up. Is that okay? Can everybody see? All right. Okay. Thank you, Godela. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for the invitation to start the discussion with area studies. I'm working, as Joe explains, in Francophone African language-based area studies, and it's great to be sharing a platform with colleagues in very different fields from mine in Chinese and Russian studies. Looking forward to those. But first, my 10-minute slot will cover 3 points. Initially, I'll look at the debate around decolonizing pedagogy and research and its relevance to interdisciplinary area studies. After that, I'll mention very briefly 2 projects, one with schools and the other PhD ECR training project that both respond to the decolonizing agenda. The links are in the chat. Then I'll finish with a few thoughts on the future of modern languages departments and promise not to be too downbeat. So I'll start with a word about interdisciplinary area studies and how the decolonizing debate has emerged in relation to this field. I read with interest an article published last month in the Times Higher entitled "Area Studies Must Be Decolonized." Interestingly, the author, a geographer at Royal Holloway, begins by revealing his amazement at first encountering this strange pseudo-discipline on his arrival in the UK from South Africa. His admission is particularly interesting because much of area studies in our universities was born in and of the colonization of Africa. Indeed, I'd argue that my field of area studies came from the same colonial dynamic that shaped the emergence of the study of modern languages in UK universities. It's no coincidence that the languages approved for the introduction of the modern languages tripos at Cambridge were French, German, and Italian. It is also noteworthy that Cambridge welcomed the first intake for modern languages tripos at the exact moment in 1884, when the European colonizing nations were gathering in Berlin to resolve the scramble for Africa. That Cambridge melded modern languages learning to the study of elite literary culture and thought in source language was likewise no accident. Political and social sciences were accommodated elsewhere, to emerge as language-based area studies, I believe, in the post-colonial era. I make these points just to highlight how decolonizing pedagogy for scholars working in African language-based area studies comes with multiple imperatives. So it's with those imperatives in mind that I've been exploring this debate. Like many of you, I've now attended a considerable number of events discussing decolonizing pedagogy, research, and the academy more generally. I attended the first day of the conference hosted by the AMLUK last September called Decolonizing Modern Languages. It's so informative. I've now watched all the remaining contributions thanks to the podcasts. I've also been attending events in my area studies fields of politics and social policy, being the disciplines of my research training. After a first degree in French literature and thought, my MPhil was in political theory and policy making, and my doctorate on Francophone Africa focused on social policy analysis in its political context. So I've also attended decolonizing social and political sciences events in various locations, from South Africa to Switzerland to Quebec to the Netherlands and in the UK. So for me personally, the debate is crucially important for ethical as much as professional reasons. Some UK events are focused on the institutional racism and sexism that persists in our universities. These remain major and urgent issues for sector leaders to address. From the professional perspective, I'm interested to inform and transform my own practice from this debate, not least as I work on materials for coming generations of teachers and scholars. There have been so many events generating a veritable tidal wave of ideas. To sort them in my own mind, I ended up putting them into three categories according to approach. I'm calling these decolonial minimalism, inclusive curriculum, and decolonial maximalism. The first, decolonial minimalism, accommodates the kind of entry-level engagement where we just review our reading list and inject evidence of some diversity in primary and critical literature. Now, it's not always acknowledged in the debates, but this approach can cause more harm than good. The second category, inclusive curriculum, is encouraging revisions and transformations at modular, departmental, faculty, and institutional level. Kingston University, for example, introduced inclusive curriculum at university level in 2017. Leeds, as we heard at the conference, is taking a faculty approach. My third category, decolonial maximalism, is where radical rethinking coheres around structural reform. There's far less evidence of this on the ground. A rare example is the Indian scholar Kakali Bhattacharya, who has developed a model for decolonizing research and research-led teaching in 5 moves, as she puts it. Pretty much all of them encounter structural and cultural barriers in and around the academy. Another, perhaps more familiar example is Achille Mbembe's approach to the colonial as a planetary phenomenon, requiring a planetary approach to decolonizing. So like all of us, I'm countering a multiplicity of responses to the decolonizing agenda. But if there's one issue that garners consensus, it's the need to address the vastly unequal access to academic resources experienced by Global South scholars. This leads to the call for more digitized resources on genuine open access. On that point, I'll share now those 2 interdisciplinary area studies projects I mentioned earlier. The first example is an open access digital space housing archival and contemporary resources in French and English on the area that became French West Africa in the wake of that Berlin Conference of 1884. It offers multimedia resources to uncover evidence of how the colonial project continues to shape the modern world, in this case in African spaces previously occupied by a European colonial power. The resources are aimed at civil society, schools, students and researchers It's been generating some positive feedback and many thousands of hits, but I cannot deny that the tensions that permeate a space that is born of and remains an evidence of coloniality is challenging. I worry about it, but I understand that being out of your comfort zone is part of the process of decolonizing your materials. Now, I don't assume that a little project like that one makes even a ripple in the broader issue of inequalities in access. On the other hand, I have been impressed by the efforts the IMLR has been making to expand massively the resources on open access. Institutions and institutes have a much better chance of making a more valuable and permanent contribution. So this is an example of materials being made available. I thought it might be of more general interest today as it extends across all our languages. These seminars on fieldwork objectives and methods for PGR and ECR are delivered live via Zoom by a group of colleagues with experience in conducting fieldwork in language-based area studies in various parts of the world. The issues around decolonizing research are addressed throughout the series. Now, I could go on about this, but I think it's now drawing towards the point where I have to make my conclusions. So I will conclude with a few words on the future of modern languages departments. As we know, several modern languages departments have closed recently, primarily because we're hemorrhaging students, and we have been for 3 decades. Some institutions will survive, but if we don't make a transformational move, we risk seeing languages return to the position they occupied before the Robbins reforms of the 1960s. Clearly, we want to avoid that. And perhaps one way of testing options for growth is to explore new interdisciplinary partnerships. The argument for interdisciplinary innovation was one before we even entered the global pandemic. In 2019, the Royal Society reported, I quote, "We need to equip the future workforce with skills and knowledge from across multiple disciplines." And it even pressed for modern languages explicitly in its proposals for A-level reform. A similar point is made in the British Academy report of May 2020, where it argues for modern languages in interdisciplinary combinations of shape subjects. That idea sounds interesting, but the potential of a meeting between shape and STEM should not be overlooked. There's been a false separation between arts and sciences in UK education for as long as anyone can remember. I'm wondering whether we can imagine new symbiotic disciplinary relations where our linguistic and cultural expertise can penetrate deeply into the multiple transnational and pluriversal contexts that generate and perpetuate planetary crisis. And could we attract students to degrees that empower them to make the maximum personal contribution to restoring our planet to habitability? 21st century challenges are not just science issues. Challenges that face humanity on a planetary level need to be faced with disciplines equipped to operate across territorial, linguistic, and perceptual borders. There is a department where you find all those skills under one roof in languages, linguistics, and area studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that brilliant talk, and thank you for keeping to time. I'm going to move right on to Derek Hurd, who's our next speaker. Derek is acting head of the Department of Languages and Cultures at Lancaster University, and he's also deputy director of the Confucius Institute and senior lecturer in Chinese studies. Derek, I'm going to hand right over to you. Thank you. You're muted, Derek.
Right, brilliant. Thanks very much, Joe. and I'll just try to get this to full size. I hope you can see that. So my talk today is going to be on mainstreaming critical language pedagogy and on raising the status and visibility of pedagogical research in languages. Now, why is it not moving forward? Oh, there we go. So I'm going to take a standpoint of languages here, principally because I feel that my own research and teaching crosses over the categories of language-based area studies and modern languages and over humanities and social science approaches. So I thought I'm just going to try and make it simple, speak to what's central, and hopefully it will be relevant to people in whatever category they find themselves or choose to identify with. So in languages, capital L, I'm going to make this argument that language teaching and research is undervalued and less visible than teaching and research on cultural topics. And that this is far from ideal, and that this low status of language teaching, and this is a point that's been made already, it's not just me, of course, is making this. The low status of language teaching and related research leads to an over-reliance on theories from outside of languages teaching and research. There seems to be some delay in it moving to the next slide. Let's see. It was doing fine earlier on. There we go. Where is languages research? These are excerpts from websites, languages departments' websites that describe the kind of research that they do. And you will struggle to see any mention of language research in there, or pedagogical research. So this is an institutional-wide issue about the visibility of language research. Now, what are the problems facing us if we try to raise the status of pedagogical research? Well, there are structural barriers often for language teaching focused colleagues in terms of their job role descriptions, contract formats, career pathways. The structural issues that need to be dealt with at institutional level. Higher esteem is often placed or always placed on cultural research. I'm just using the catch-all term here, cultural research, for research on film, literature, and culture and society. And when we talk about research-informed teaching, I've found that it often seems to refer to cultural topics and not so much to pedagogical ones. So how do we raise the status of pedagogical research? Well, my solution that I'm proposing here is to focus on critical language pedagogy. And I'm sure you're all aware, critical pedagogy was developed by Paulo Freire many years ago as a transformative pedagogy to challenge oppressive political and social structures, to be very influential. So what is critical pedagogy in language teaching? Well, it is a kind of approach that supports and advances teaching and the study of languages in ways that would promote social justice. And it implies a critical use of language. And I think this is what we need to focus on. Because languages, as has been said already, are never just neutral. And the problem, however, lies in that there is often a resistance or it's not high up on the agenda to challenge the idea that languages have a kind of ideological neutrality. So I think we would all acknowledge that languages are never just neutral, but the way in which languages are taught in the classroom can sometimes reinforce a notion of a kind of ideological neutrality of languages. Now, language does produce and reinforce inequality. Therefore, it also has the capacity to challenge inequality and hegemonic practices. And we can utilize this potency of language. And we need more research on this. There are few investigations of critical language practices or critical language teacher education practices. One example was a fantastic workshop that was held at Lancaster a few weeks ago on gender inclusive language in the classrooms. It was aimed at teachers, professional development, and we've been doing these kind of workshops for years. It was the first online one. We had over 200 teachers attend, and that, from international locations as well. The exam board's very interested in working with the organizer. Sasha Stolan's a colleague of mine who's been inspirational, along with other colleagues at Lancaster, in developing and sharing pedagogical research and teaching practice. And what we did in the workshop was we split into different language strands. There were bits where we all came together and bits where we split into language strands. And in the Chinese section, there was a discussion about the female gender pronoun ta, which you can see there, which was invented in the early 20th century by Chinese feminists. It was a creation that gave a graphic component to the character that represented femaleness. Now that we're into a different era where we're challenging gender binaries, there are new characters, Chinese characters, being advocated for that enable a kind of expression and representation of non-binary gender identities. So this kind of history of the language of a gender pronoun, I would argue, it should be brought into the language classroom. I think, and I know it is in many cases, but I don't think it is done so systematically, and I don't think it's done sufficiently. And it's too important to be left to the cultural classroom, I believe. The issues that are raised of colonialism and decolonisation, the modernity, forces of modernity, gender binary and language, networks of activists across the globe, and the interaction of the socio-political and linguistic. Why are we not really systematically addressing this in the language classroom? And I think that if we adopted a critical language pedagogy approach, we could forefront the kind of inequalities that are raised through the use of language. So this is my final slide. I'm arguing for a mainstreaming of critical language pedagogy. Critical language teaching, I would say, is more than debating political issues in the target language. We do a lot of that already. It's more than discussing etymologies. It's actually calling out the words and phrases that reinforce inequalities and teaching new lexicons to help create progressive social possibilities. I think that energizes the language classroom. I think it will attract students to languages. And I think it will also raise the status and visibility of pedagogical research in language. And that's my bibliography. So thank you very much. And that's me. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Derek, and thanks again for sticking to the time. I'm going to go straight on and introduce our next speaker, who is Stephen Hutchins from the University of Manchester. Stephen is Professor of Russian Studies and President of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies. And Stephen's title today is Modern Languages as Area Studies Towards a New Humanities or Path to Nowhere. Stephen. You're on mute, Stephen.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yep. Okay, good. Thank you. By the way, I'm no longer BASI's president. That term ended some while ago, but thank you anyway for recognising that role. There we are. This is a sort of very condensed version of a paper that I actually published in a longer form in the new journal, New Area Studies, and the link to that article is in the first slide there. The paper comes out of some thinking that I was doing as part of the AURI project that I led, and reflects discussions with colleagues. I apologize to those of you who've heard different versions of this paper before. So those of you who know about AURI, its history is partly traceable to the 5 national LBAS language-based area studies centres. And these centres focused on languages traditionally associated with area studies, so Arabic, Russian, Chinese, and Japanese. It's interesting that the national subject associations for these areas, including the Russian one that you mentioned, unlike those for European languages such as French and Italian, tend to combine representation from modern languages and social science disciplines, including politics, economics, sociology, and history. Rightly, the AHRC opened ARI up to modern languages more broadly, but reasons for identifying LBAS with this restricted subset of languages partly reflect the Cold War, whose end produced a crisis for area studies, which we can define very simply as interdisciplinary research pertaining to particular geographical, national, or cultural regions. Recently, area studies has begun reinventing itself, and I want to focus briefly here today on how modern languages can contribute to that renewal process. So the impact of the fall of communism on Sovietology and other area studies sub-disciplines was compounded by developments in the social sciences, where you've got to turn to grand theory, supplanting careful study of individual geographical regions. And a very vivid example of that trend's influence on post-Sovietology disciplines is transitology, which was founded on the notion that regime change, inevitably from authoritarianism to democratic models, can be studied as a common process. It soon became apparent that the assumed trajectory is not universally guaranteed. One only has to look at what's happening in Putin's Russia to be sure of that. But as region-focused social scientists were absorbed by departments in which these trends prevailed, it became quite difficult for them to sustain careers founded on dedication to regional specificity. And the resulting tendency towards separate wings of area studies was reinforced by the new impact agendas of the early 2000s, welcomed by social scientists, but less so by modern linguists, though that has thankfully changed in recent years. And then the further problem was ironically, the success of university language centres offering the sort of no-nonsense language training that many craved, and their success combined with declining recruitment was and still is challenging research-led language departments. During the same period, however, a rationale for the renewal of area studies emerged as the post-Cold War vacuum was filled by radical jihadism emerging from regions, the lack of expertise in which was confirmed first by 9/11 and then the unpredicted stirrings of the Arab Spring, and subsequent disappointment at the failures, at our Western failures, underscored the need for relevant cultural and linguistic knowledge. Equally unsettling, as I've mentioned, was Russia's belligerent re-emergence under Putin. Without regional expertise, policymakers grasp at defunct Cold War paradigms. But this expertise has to be language-based. So to give you one example, comprehension of the recent Ukraine crisis was hampered by consistent confusion over terms for East Ukraine's Russian-speaking population. Russian citizens, ethnic Russians, pro-Russian population occurred interchangeably in policymaking documents and in the press. In fact, the preferred term in Russian public discourse is соотечественники, a purposefully ambiguous term meaning compatriots. Area studies really needs to collaborate with modern languages in tracing the interregional tensions and flows traversing our interconnected world to uncover the transnational identities and geopolitical realignments they generate. And the very Latin etymology of the term region, from regere, to rule, points to the need to explore post-imperial reconfigurations of center-periphery relationships. And so we require the emergence of this approach requires the acknowledgement of new communities within and across national boundaries, and the recognition that whilst nations refuse to fade, global flows create fresh interpretive tools. Study of their interrelationships demands an integration of quantitative methodologies with qualitative models drawn from cultural studies. Fortunately, area studies has always hosted expertise that cuts across arts and social sciences divide. So a renewed case for region-specific knowledge rests on recognition that we're rooted in circumstances whose diversity can't be generalized. In fact, I've skipped a slide there. This includes the languages spoken by particular communities, along with the different modes of conceptualizing the world they encode. And when rethinking our disciplinary future, we modern linguists must ask fundamental questions about the knowledge we're generating. So are a priori understandings of how texts generate meaning merely calibrated by studying texts written in particular languages? Or can such generalizations only be achieved through inductive comparative study? This latter approach insists that lack of linguistic skills impedes our understanding of particular spaces. Language is fundamental to the identities, both of the new communities that are being forged across national borders by migration flows, and of the super diverse communities inhabiting urban spaces within them. These communities are often diasporic, defined by lack of attachment to a fixed region. Sometimes the region in question is more conceptual or even ideological than geographic, like the so-called Russian world, Ruski Mir. This is, of course, the domain of critical geopolitics, a new area studies subbranch. Nonetheless, a series of embodied place and its connection to language remains central to all community building projects. And so rather than merely facilitate social scientific study of Russian politics or Brazilian society, modern linguists should install space-language community relationships at the epistemological core of this new area studies, and I would argue of a revitalized humanities more broadly. Apart from the common interest in reimagining space and the shared history of decline, and now renewal, there are tactical, if controversial, arguments for linguists to ally themselves with new area studies. There's no doubt that institutional structures do create formidable practical barriers to realizing this goal, timetabling being just one of them. And I recognize that controversy, but less controversial is the argument for maintaining undergraduate programs combining high-level language training with the study of relevant histories and cultures to provide the thick contextual understanding of socio-political phenomena that new area studies investigates. And here I think the importance of integrating language and non-language components in modern language degrees, whether you do so via more target language teaching or better, in my view, through a much tighter alignment of the respective language and culture syllabi. That whole debate acquires huge importance. The new area studies strategy for modern languages would also point to a kind of revived philology involving attention to analysis of discourses, idiolects, and speech genres. All of this sounds like a tall order, I admit, but I would strongly suggest that it is not a pathway to nowhere. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's brilliant. I'm just going to very briefly then introduce our discussant, who is Charles Forsdyk. And Charles, as many of us know, is James Barrow Professor of French at the University of Liverpool and a Leadership Fellow for Translating Cultures. So, Charles, we've got about 5 minutes, and then I think we'll open to questions. We can probably go on a bit past 12 because we did start a bit late. Charles.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to the IMLR for providing this space for a much needed forum, modern languages, area studies, and linguistics. And also thanks to Claire, Derek, and Steve for covering so much ground in half an hour there and providing a whole series of provocations that I think we need to pick up. This event is all about the way in which we are by our nature eclectic. And I think it's important, and all three speakers have done this, to acknowledge our disciplinary configurations, to acknowledge our disciplinary histories. Both Claire and Steve in particular focused on histories there. We need to talk about our span across social sciences and arts and humanities. But what's very clear from all three interventions there is that any sense of previous divisions need to be forged into a clearer sense of strength and a clearer sense of a purposeful collective project around areas of commonality, whether that's language, mobility, or increasingly transnational connections. And I'm really interested in the way in which that sense of a shared project emerged. Just to give one example, Steve there talking about thick contextual understandings. Well, for me, that chimes very much with what we often talk about in literary or cultural studies, a little vaguely, I think, when we talk about close reading. And I think there are all sorts of possible resonances there where we can learn. Now, all three speakers foregrounded the importance of language across the curriculum, whether that's in terms of the integration of content and language, or whether that's in terms of bridging the sorts of gaps that Derek was talking about between content and language teaching. I think part of that, and Derek made a very clear case, is around challenging robustly, and I think this is increasingly the case, the dismissal of pedagogical research. It's about, and Derek made this very clear, engagement with critical language pedagogy, also extending, I think, more broadly, maybe we'll talk about this in the subsequent session, into aspects of applied linguistics. But I think this is unapologetically about recentering language in all we do, making clear, and Derek and Claire both made this very apparent, that languages are never neutral. Mary Louise Pratt described modern languages, and I think the broader areas represented today, as knowing languages and knowing the world through languages. And I think that's a concept that very much bridges the gap between the areas that we represent. It's partly, I think, about nurturing language-sensitive approaches. It's partly about recognizing language as one of a whole series of social categories. Crucially, that leads us to where Steve led us, I think, this sense that modern languages and related fields are not handmaidens for other disciplinary areas. This is picking up on comments in the chat too. They are key partners. They have a catalytic role to play across other subject areas. And I really urge us to explore much more widely Steve's idea of the space-language community relationship, which I think is extremely useful. Final element, Joe, and then I shall stop and we can open up the conversation. That's about, and all three speakers, Claire, Derek and Steve, focused on this. That's about speaking into, from our disciplinary positions, the context of the present. Now, for Derek and Claire, that was very much about debates around decolonisation. And I really appreciated Claire's very useful scale there that I think we can all take back to our departments, minimalism to maximalism, going via the inclusive curriculum. That, I think, takes us into three core areas. One is the way in which increasingly we're seeing a shift from advocacy to activism. And I think Claire is quite right that integrating 21st century challenges into the curriculum is a way to engage students in new ways. I think some of those challenges are linguistic as well, ranging from linguophobia to the exclusionary practices of institutions, disciplines, and policies around language. Second point that strikes me as very important is how we share our work, whether that's across different disciplines, whether that's through various modes of impact, Steve in particular thinking about policy, Derek thinking about pedagogy, or whether that's embracing what Claire mentioned, and that's the increasing use of the digital. And the final point for me is partnerships. I shall stop, Joe. The role of our links, particularly to schools, fascinating to see the conversations around this in the chat, but also a broader, what I'd call a sort of de-imperializing solidarity with partners, particularly in the areas in which we work, because that leads us to what for me was at the heart of this session, and that's a questioning of the epistemologies, and the histories on which our disciplines and by extension our pedagogical practices are based. So again, thanks ever so much to Claire, Derek and Steve. Great start to the workshop, and I look forward to hearing the wider discussion now. Thanks a lot, Joe. Back over to you.
Thanks very much, Charles. That's brilliant. I don't know if the speakers wanted to respond to what Charles has said before we open up to questions. Please do feel free to just kind of unmute yourselves and jump in. No, I mean, Claire, Stephen, Derek, you're shaking your head.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was a very interesting and useful summary. One issue that I didn't mention that is coming increasingly to the fore is the external debate around the transformations that are happening in universities and how we address structural changes. We have to face a very different scenario in the post-2017 Higher Education and Research Act world, where we have Office for Students and UCRI. This is changing those power dynamics, and that also has an influence on the way in which we within universities can lead this debate as well. So, but there's a lot, and there are many other things, obviously, that feed into this, but that's some concern, I think.
Thank you, Claire. I'm conscious that there's been some, as Charles mentioned, there's been some comments in the chat that I'll just refer to. So we've had some language teachers from schools who are present today, which is great to see. There's a comment here from a head of German in a secondary school. We'd love to be able to make more. I think this is commenting on Derek's presentation. We'd love to be able to make more of this topic in lessons. We're so pushed for time, covering course content, not enough lessons on the timetable. So it's really tough. Would be great if exam boards could put this topic on the AS A-level course. There's also an additional comment here on the kind of how overwhelmed teachers are with workload issues, which I think again we picked up on this. Perhaps Stephen picked up on that in his presentation. We need to call for modern foreign languages to become a compulsory subject from the primary sector to the secondary sector in schools. An integral change in curriculum is urgently needed. And then another comment here about joining up the primary and secondary sectors so that secondary teachers are not starting from scratch with pupils in year 7, but can build on and consolidate primary language learning. Perhaps I could just ask a quick question off the back of that. And I mean, in terms of the curriculum in schools, it seems to me, from what I'm aware of, it's very language skills based. And I suppose that the question for me, I mean, it's really a question to Derek, but perhaps to the other contributors as well. Is there a way of incorporating change into that curricula without necessarily changing it? So I'm thinking about this critical language pedagogy and that being an opportunity to open up some of the curricula that already exists in schools, rather than necessarily having to struggle for change. Derek, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that? And just responding to those comments as well that were made in the chat.
I think the appetite in schools for a holistic approach to the study of language, culture, play, society is there. And that's demonstrated by the over 200 teachers who attended the event at Lancaster, and it's demonstrated again here in the chat. So they may be fairly language based, the curriculum at the moment, but what can make languages exciting, what can make languages more than a technical skill, is precisely this locating of language in a kind of activist mode, if you like, in terms of what can languages do, or languages, area studies, culture, whatever we're calling it, what can we do that can make a difference in the world, and can make the world a better place. And if we put that, and that's the heart of critical pedagogy, if we can put that right at the center of our teaching, whether it's in the schools or in the universities, then we're going to make languages an incredibly and even more exciting discipline, because it will energize students. They will see, it's not sociology, great discipline, anthropology, great discipline, history, etc., etc. But languages has something unique to offer that only we, as language specialists, whether we're ML or LBAS or whatever, only we can offer the expertise, on these gender pronouns, or on the kinds of language that governments and corporations use for greenwashing, and the kinds of language that activists and NGOs, progressive groups use to counteract the greenwashing language, or the decolonisation of racist language in the target languages that we study. We have that expertise. And we should be putting that at the center of our teaching and our research.
Thank you very much, Derek. I don't know if any of the other speakers wanted to comment on any of those schools questions. I mean, there's another question. There's a specific question here from Sarah about she'd be interested to hear thoughts about current proposals for the content of the modern languages GCSE in English, which are open for consultation and would be very narrowly focused on assessing the language system to the exclusion of cultures, literature, etc. And I mean, it strikes me that the schools pipeline is incredibly important to pick up on what Claire said. The students that or I think Gordon mentioned this as well, the students that we need to kind of bring through in the future. But I just wondered whether any of the other panelists have thoughts on that. Please feel free to
word, Joe.
Go ahead, Claire, and then if Stephen goes after you.
Yes, I've been working with PGCE students and tutors around the French curriculum, the new curriculum that was brought in new, so to speak, in 2017-18. And there are interesting opportunities in there to talk about these more, transnational issues, things that really could engage students. But there's an enormous pressure on teachers' time, trying to get materials together, respond to curriculum changes, that actually, when it came to the end of year exams, it was extremely difficult to actually implement anything that made a significant difference and responded to those reforms. So, the school teachers, of course, will bear witness to this, that there needs to be a lot more resource provided behind these initiatives in order to, to make them happen. And of course, we have the same problem in universities. So it's we're time poor, and that's been a huge issue anyway with the people that I have been discussing this with.
Thanks, Claire. Stephen, I'm conscious you wanted to comment on that.
Sorry. This was just a kind of spontaneous thought that's only just occurred to me. So it's not very well articulated, but and I don't know a great deal about the school curriculum. But what has occurred to me is that the press is full of discussion about the need to introduce various forms of media literacy into the school curriculum. It's become almost a sort of moral panic. We're awash with conspiracy theory, fake news, and so on, and we really need to bring media literacy to the heart of the school curriculum. I think there's space for linguistic expertise within this broader understanding of media literacy. Attention to telltale signs that reveal foreignness in particular sort of ways of presenting news, and the way that terms kind of shift their meaning when they transition across languages, all of which I think does have a bearing on our approaches to news consumption and media literacy. So I wonder whether we should be pushing at an inclusion of the expertise that languages can offer in that whole debate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. Gordler, you got your hand up. Yeah, did you want to come in? Please feel free to unmute yourselves. We do have about 10 minutes left. I thought we could run over about 5 minutes, if that's okay with people, given we started a bit late. Gordler.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's really fascinating. I just wanted to make a slightly different point. So you were stressing the idea of the space language community joining up, which I completely agree with, and also the need to think together language and culture. Completely agreed. What I feel is slightly possibly getting lost here is the study of texts, of literature, which is also, part of what we do. And I just wanted to give an example of the conference on transnational neighborhoods that I was involved with last year. And we brought together people from urban studies and from sociology and from geography and literary studies. And what became very, very clear was that it was the literary studies more than anything else that brought in the idea of imaginaries, the idea of future. What could the future look like? What direction can we go into? So I just wanted to make a plea to, when we talk about languages and cultures, not to lose the literatures, because I think they really are also central in this.
Thank you, Gula. I don't know if anyone wanted to respond to that. I mean, I'm conscious that there's a lot of chat in the chat, so I'm not going to be able to pick up everything that's going on in the chat. There's a lot of interesting examples, especially regarding the schools context, and perhaps we can leave the session open, people can have a look at the chat over the break. But I'm just conscious that if people do want to chip in, then you're very welcome to unmute yourselves. I did have a quick, Charles, were you gonna, sorry.
Yeah, no, Joe, if nobody else wants to come in, I'm happy just to make a couple of points. Just again, looking at the chat, great conversations going on there, particularly about the way in which we can have a holistic take to these discussions, going from primary through to higher education. And I'm really looking forward to the session after lunch with the colleagues talking about linguistics in school-based language learning. Two other things struck me as really important, and one we haven't really talked about yet. We're focusing on modern languages, area studies, and linguistics. There is the whole area of, if for want of a better term, community languages as well. And it was really good to see recognition from Thomas in the chat that we're talking about schools as multilingual spaces. And one of the roles of those working in our areas is precisely to challenge default monolingualism and the assumptions around that. And that's why an anecdote around the exam board in the chat, but a very telling one. I've heard examples of exam boards, for example, for instance, of saying, oh, you can't do the presentation on Tintin because Hergé was not French. And on the not only are we addressing issues around monolingualism, we're also addressing this very narrow reduction of the language to a nation, which will link up, I think, with some of the later conversations. What struck me very much, and there are many listening in here who are working in schools on a daily basis, but what struck me is something that came out of the session, and that's that idea of moving languages from the quarantine space of the language classroom, which is getting away from what Steve was talking about to a certain extent around handmaiden function to this much more an instrumental function, this much more catalytic idea. And two of the things that I've been really encouraged by in recent months are encouragement of year 12, year 13 pupils doing EPQs, to think about how that is also a space in which they can engage with languages. And something else, Charles Burdett might mention this at the end of the afternoon, as part of the Transnationalizing Modern Languages project, excellent work in Edinburgh schools looking at languages across the curriculum, particularly in the history classroom and in the arts classroom. and thinking about how these issues that interest us can have this effect more widely across the curriculum.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm conscious, did Charles Burdett, did you want to say something?
Yeah, we will be certainly talking about that. Thank you, Charles. And we will absolutely at the IMLR, together with Bilingualism Matters, we are planning a conference in the autumn on the relationship between modern languages, broadly speaking, as a university disciplinary area, and community languages, and how we can hook up the two, which is absolutely fundamental. One of the, I thought, great presentations. I thought in just one point is, Claire, you're arguing very strongly for interdisciplinarity, and rightly. Interdisciplinarity requires a sense of disciplinarity, a point within the discourse, and that, as all three speakers have talked about, in some way needs to be strengthened, because it's from that position of clarity of what one is that one can engage in more productive interdisciplinarity conversations. In some ways, I also like to Stephen, I mean, in some ways, modern languages has to be a broad, overarching subject area. And I think in some ways it does certainly encompass, but does not reduce to that encompassment, area studies. Area studies sits squarely within modern languages, but also sits outside. I think it is that question of an inclusive and disciplinary, clear sense of where we're coming from that we can be more effective if we develop.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm conscious of the time, but I mean, there's also some interesting comments in the chat. There's a question here, a very important question, I think, about this context and the kinds of cultural movements like Brexit, and what will need to happen for Britain to take languages seriously. And I don't know, I mean, that's a big question there, that's in the chat. And then we've got this question, a comment on employability, this, what Charles is mentioning, the kind of the problem of an employability agenda being kind of instrumentalizing languages for that employability agenda, the employability skills box. I just wanted to offer the speakers a final chance to respond to any of those questions or any of the other points that have been raised before we close the session. Claire, do you have anything to add?
To unmute myself. Yes, thank you for those comments. And the unemployability agenda now has been going on for a couple of decades, and it's not unrelated to the admissions trends, downward admissions trends that we've been seeing in modern languages. Students don't buy into this, and this idea that a degree can be valued in relation to personal gain is maybe losing credibility among the current generation. Maybe they have bigger horizons and looking at bigger issues, such as how one makes a contribution to improving our world and increasing well-being and so on. So I so agree with the other speakers, with Stephen and with Derek, who've been kind of pushing that point that we're so much more than just being able to kind of order a cup of coffee in a good accent when you're in wherever, which is pretty much the way that we're kind of reduced to being presented in so much of the media. So yes, so I'll pass on now as we're running out of time.
Thank you, Claire. Stephen?
I suppose I just had one quick follow-up to Godela's important point about not forgetting about the value of traditional study of literary text, which feel very wedded to as someone who went through that training and still value literature as very important to the language curriculum. But I think there are ways of kind of perhaps almost adopting a sort of hegemonic sort of expansion of the relevance of literary studies, because if you to include aesthetics, and when you begin to think about how study of literary text can inform one's understanding of aesthetics, you can begin to make interventions on political rhetoric and the intersection between popular culture and politics and modes of performance and so on, all of which are becoming more and more relevant to how politics operates, to give one example. So yes, let's keep and preserve a space for traditional study of literary texts, but let's also kind of be a bit bolder and take the expertise that we have and apply it elsewhere.
Thank you, Stephen. Derek?
Yes, thanks to everybody who's commented. It's fantastic to see all the responses and the fellow panelists as well. My final comment would just be share. And one of the really energizing aspects of the gender pronouns event was that we were sharing experiences across languages, and German, French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese. Let's produce textbooks, let's produce material that shares across languages. Let's have little inserts in our textbooks that say, this is how the Chinese, it may be a French textbook, but it can look at how Chinese pronouns are being investigated, and it can make key points about language, space, and community that are pertinent to us and our identity as a sector. So I think the more we collaborate, the more we share, the better.
Thank you very much, Derek. I think that's a nice point on which to end this panel. Thank you very much indeed to the speakers, Claire, Derek and Stephen, and thank you very much for Charles, for responding. I wanted to remind speakers for the next session, if you could please arrive 15 minutes, just for the speakers, if you could arrive 15 minutes before the session starts, so we can check screen sharing, that kind of thing is working. But just thank you again, and thank you to the audience for brilliant comments and questions. Thanks very much. We'll see you in just under an hour's time.
I'll get kind of quite straight to the speakers. The format will be the same as the last session. We'll have 3 10-minute presentations followed by a respondent. So I'll, as I say, get started so that I don't take any of the speakers' time. And our first speaker today is Michelle Sheehan, who is Professor of Linguistics at Anglia Ruskin. And she is going to be talking about a place for linguistics in school-based language learning. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Naomi. So I'm just going to share. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. Okay, thanks very much to the organisers. I'm really happy to be here today on behalf of the Linguistics Mfl Project at what really feels to be a kind of special, almost a unique event, actually. So I'm really looking forward to the discussions and hearing the other presentations. This is joint work with Alice Kaur, Anna Huffinger, Jonathan Castan, Norma Schifano and Sasha Stollen, some of whom are here. And what I'm going to be doing is essentially talking about what we think linguistics can offer modern languages, and then talking a bit about our project, Linguistics in MFL, which has been going for a couple of years now. And then I'm going to focus on just telling you about some of the findings that we have so far. So what are the potential benefits of linguistics as part of modern languages? Well, the main benefit really, we feel, is it offers kind of new ways of thinking about languages and about language. So it takes, linguistics takes a descriptive rather than an evaluative or prescriptive view of language. And this, we would argue, allows students to develop a deeper understanding of what languages are and how they work. And ultimately, this might help to reduce linguistic misconceptions and prejudices. So in the context of, we're trying to decolonize the curriculum, this is actually really essential because certain varieties are very much stigmatized, and we need to kind of change this and make people aware of how this works. Linguistics also offers a bridge between language skills, which are very much the focus for teaching languages within schools, and the cultural content, which becomes much more apparent at university level. So linguistics can kind of allow students to kind of understand the differences between those two things. And this in turn gives them improved metalinguistic awareness. This is actually perceived to be useful by language learners, as we'll see, at least the students that have participated in our work. And also it's been claimed to be to improve proficiency for modern language learners within the sort of UK school context. That's what the MFL Pedagogy Review claims. So what else? Well, also linguistics offers different skills within the context of modern languages. So these are skills for autonomous language study, which is one of the stated aims of the secondary curriculum. Certainly the A-levels are supposed to offer those things. It also, in kind of taking sort of puzzle solving and giving analytical and critical skills to students, it offers a nice connection with STEM and with STEM skills, which are so much, praised by everybody these days. And there's also intersection with other areas of the curriculum. So of course, English language A-level, which has a lot of linguistic content, but also history and geography. So in learning about the history of the language, they're of course learning about the history of the people and the cultures that speak that language. And why are all these things important? Well, we think that this is important because linguistics appeals to different kinds of students. So many language students really like linguistics. And as it appeals to different kinds of students, this may help to attract new kinds of students to the study of languages. So this may help ultimately with the languages crisis that the British Academy and others have spoken about so much recently. So what's our project? Well, the Linguistics Mfl Project was set up by myself and Norma Schifano, who's at Birmingham. And it's a group of academic linguists working on Romance and Germanic languages based in UK universities. And we kind of all come to this as linguists who started off within modern languages. And we kind of had this desire to get some linguistics into MFL provision in schools to see if it can, to see if it's of interest and see if it's feasible. So we're working with experienced teachers and also with external collaborators to do that. So what have we done? Well, we started by creating mini courses on French, German and Spanish linguistics. And we then decided to do some taster days for Portuguese and French heritage speakers, and actually Kate Lightfoot organised the French one of those. The arrows indicate where the funding came from, so you can just look at that. We also offered a number of training sessions for primary and secondary PGC students, and also for established teachers. So these have been at kind of organised events and also going into schools. And finally, the main thing we're all working on at the moment is a co-creation project funded by Language Acts and the University of Bristol. And this is a bit different in that we're co-creating materials for the existing A-level syllabus in collaboration with experienced teachers. So this is kind of an ongoing project. We've met with the teachers 4 or 5 times and created the materials together with them. So what I'm going to do in the remaining 5 minutes or so is just to give you a bit of a brief overview of some of the feedback that we've got so far. And I'm only going to talk, because the time's very limited, about the mini course and the co-created materials. So the mini course, as I said, there were 3 different mini courses for French, German and Spanish, and they had 4 classes covering the sounds, structures, variation and history in the languages. So they were very kind of, brief overviews, and we created them ourselves in collaboration with some external collaborators, and they were taught by teachers mainly. So sometimes we actually went into schools and taught them as well. But we have 29 schools that taught the mini course, and we've got data, as you can see, from quite a number of students who who were exposed to the mini courses. So we've written this up in a paper, which we're very happy, it's just been accepted in Modern Languages Open, which we're very happy to share with anyone. But I'm just going to offer a few snippets of the findings. So, sorry. After taking the course, most students agreed or strongly agreed, this means that we got 4 on a 5-point Likert scale, that they feel they have a better understanding of what linguistics is, so that was good. They feel it's useful to study linguistics when learning a language, so there's that perceived usefulness. They thought that learning a bit of linguistics had helped them with their language skills. They would recommend it to a friend, and they felt that linguistics should be taught as part of MFL at school. So there was kind of, they kind of liked the course, and they, probably more importantly, they found it useful and they perceived it to be useful for their language learning. We also asked them a lot of questions about, what they liked and disliked. And here you can see that many of them in that question, it was an open text question, but many of them kind of said, well, I like the history lesson the best, and I liked the structures lesson the least. But actually, all 4 different lessons were kind of the favorite of some pupils, right? So there were pupils that liked the structures and the phonology, but obviously we can see from the results that history and variation were almost unanimously liked, and hardly anyone disliked them. So, and actually 1/3 of people responded that they enjoyed everything. So many students just liked all of the content. Others gave very specific responses. I don't know if you can see this. You can see this here, but one person said the opportunity to discuss the socio-political implications of prescriptive and descriptive approaches to linguistics, e.g., does it alienate individuals and communities when one version of grammar is deemed correct and superior to other forms? So this is a student who's only done a very short course, and they've got a quite elaborate, deep understanding of some of the issues that are kind of prominent in linguistics. The teachers were also very enthusiastic, probably unsurprisingly, because they obviously volunteered to participate, but 100% felt that the course was useful and would recommend it to other teachers. 73% felt fully confident teaching the course. The issue with the others was really to do with our use of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which it turns out kind of puts some people off, actually. Also, the students mentioned this. We found also that the teachers noted that their own subject knowledge increased and improved, and they felt that it had an impact on their teaching practice. So some of them went on to create resources and materials based on what they'd done in what we'd covered in the mini course. And they reported that the lessons triggered discussion of further topics and even some independent research projects for the oral exam. So there was a real impact of that on their students. What about the co-creation project? So I don't have much time left, I'm aware, so I'm just going to mention a few things about it. So we've created 4 classes for each language, and really the classes are focused on busting common myths about language. So for example, one of the classes for French, which Jonathan Castan and myself created with 2 teachers, is about the language of France is French, and then we talk about other languages spoken in France. So the materials are going to still being trialed this academic year. So if you are teachers, or if you know teachers, please encourage them to sign up to test them. And so far we've had feedback only from 5 schools. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that the students have said. So one of the things we asked the students was, how are these materials different from what you usually cover in your A-level classes? And here's what some of them said. So studying different versions of French instead of the one accepted exam-ready version. So there was this perception that the language was more real, that they were being exposed to. And this is interesting. It enabled a wider range of opinion and a means for debate. So there's this kind of appreciation of the idea that language is not kind of just fixed. It's actually something more that we can have an opinion about and talk about. And we also asked them what their favorite aspect of the classes was, and this is my last slide. So many of them noticed, this is only 17 students, but many of them mentioned variation. So that was what they had enjoyed most. Many of them just said, I liked it because it was something new, it was something different. So that's also really encouraging. And quite a few of them also mentioned this notion of puzzle solving. They enjoyed the activities because they were very much, engaging and stimulating. Also mentioning real life as well. And they also mentioned that they probably would have been interested even at GCSE level to do something like this. I can see that Naomi's looking at me, so I'm going to stop and just say thank you very much for your attention. Please get in touch if you're interested in the project. And I'm just going to leave you with a slide with some feedback from some of the teachers who participated in the co-creation project. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I was just turning on my camera as you'd reached your last slide, but it was perfect timing and you got through some really fantastic content in that 10 minutes. So thanks very much. So I'll move on to our second speaker now, who is Claire Wright. So Claire Wright is lecturer in linguistics and language at Leeds University. And she's going to be talking about using linguistics to help learners learn what teachers teach. Can this work for Mandarin? Thanks, Claire.
So thanks everyone, and I hope you can see my slides there. Just get going with this. So I'm going to echo very much many of the messages that Michelle shared with you about how linguistics has a particular take that we think is interesting and valuable and useful in the language classroom. I used to be an English language teacher, but I'm now moving into learning Mandarin, and as a Mandarin learner, this is what I preach, because one of the, I think, simple mysteries that affects this catastrophic decline in language take-up is partly because we don't seem to really understand how learners learn, what teachers teach, and if we could figure that out, that would make everybody's lives a bit better. So I want to try and just highlight 3 linguistic principles, one of which you'll see very much comes in line with what Michelle was saying about seeing language in descriptive terms rather than prescriptive. I also want to talk very briefly from my own background as an SLA researcher in thinking about the sort of cognitive mental processes involved in learning and how perhaps teaching and assessment could be more realistic about the flexibility we need to understand individual variation in progress, and then referring back to a lot of the comments that came out of the talk this morning about trying to see language learning in a much more diverse world issues, is how we can balance up the needs that most learners say they have about wanting to be able to communicate well and how we can teach for that against what the institutions impose in terms of assessment. So perhaps some thoughts at the end on that would be interesting. And then just very briefly, how that relates to Chinese and how particularly in a different writing system such as Chinese, we might be able to start thinking a little bit more about how we define success. And I'm just going to mention this word pluriglossia, just because I'm a linguist, so I like making up words. And maybe that's something that will just pique your interest a bit as to how this could be the future of language learning, language teaching, and thinking about language generally. So yeah, you know, we're always interested in why learners don't learn what teachers teach. And you may all have your own individual versions of what you think a successful language learner can and can't do, how you define a successful L2 learner, or as I would call it, an L2 user. Is it just to pass the exam? Is it to make the school look good? Is it to develop proficiency defined in a specific way at a particular level? Or is it something to do with how the learner's learning and engaging? What kind of value does the language learning have for you as the teacher and the learner? Is language learning just an academic subject? Is it something that has to be squeezed into that very, very narrow few minutes per week in the school curriculum? Or can we go back to thinking about language more as a general human ability? People were saying this morning about the limitation of seeing it just as a purely instrumental employability tick box. And certainly the idea of multilingual and as I'll say a little bit later, plurilingual language use being absolutely essential in our current world, and the value of creating and energizing multilingual, proactive global citizens and getting that sense of reducing, particularly in the UK, a rather prevalent discourse of otherness and foreignness. So I think, you know, my main linguistic notion that I wanted to highlight today is this idea of reframing what we mean by L2 success. This idea of trying to avoid being too prescriptive. There's a lot that Michelle's already said about the value of this, so I won't go into it again really in detail, but just to say that this echoes work that comes out of even English language development and English language teaching. I used to teach in Newcastle, where I met Michelle, and certainly what the local schools were or weren't saying about proper English, you know, kind of raised a few feathers at the time. So we want to try and really as linguists, I think, work with teachers, work with institutions to keep pushing and keep being quite campaigning about making variability the name of the game. And many of my colleagues at Leeds are working on this in relation to many kind of language situations in the UK or even globally in other contexts, such as maintaining community languages in endangered language contexts. But is this all too pie in the sky? What can we do about it? And we know it's an old and a long-lasting problem. I won't rehearse the history about how much we've been trying to balance a communicative language teaching CLT type framework for over a century, trying to build up communicative competence on the one hand, the great principles at stake in the CEFR, but you know, all this emphasis on language as a tool for use can still be problematic when it comes to implementing that in practice. And so I think, you know, as always, as linguists, we can come up with great ideas. How can we be realistic? How can we work with what's really going on? And I think 2 final sort of linguistic elements I'd like to highlight is this idea that we will all just use our cognitive abilities to learn language in different ways. this idea of the active learner, and this is very much something that Michelle's tools were highlighting there. The more the students could see something was new and meaningful and related to social context, it made them more interested and made them engage with that learning well. Whether we develop linguistically, using memory in different ways, how we use our learning for different contexts, speaking, writing, etc. This will all have an individual mix, and the more teachers can work with their learners to take account of that individual mix, then I think it keeps the learners, as I say, having a very active, engaged attitude to learning, which seems to be the best idea going. But equally, in terms of teaching and in terms of assessment, in terms of curricula, this idea of trying to get away from one size fits all, there is one correct version. And this is very much in line with what was coming out in the comments before lunch. Humans are designed to be multilingual, but that's the way our human minds work. It's a way, and a shame that there is this global English that appears to give Anglophone speakers a world advantage. But actually, I think it's to some extent at our real world cost. And above all, I think, as linguists, we want to really, really emphasize that using the kind of prestige monolingual norm as the goal, as the target, is very problematic. It's not practical in many, many ways, and it's simply not linguistically, educationally appropriate. So I think the idea of trying to broaden out our sense of what we use as the targets for language learning towards what multilinguals do is the way to go. While I've been talking, and while I carry on for the next 3 minutes, I'm just going to hopefully leave you with a few questions, which are the questions I have both as a learner of Chinese and what you and your colleagues who teach languages or work with teachers of languages, I hope perhaps battle with daily, weekly, yearly. In these material senses of decisions you have to make, what do you do about responding to student needs, which could be perhaps more flexible, which could be perhaps more diverse? Where are you in thinking about who the target is? How do you use textbooks? How could we make that bridge between content and language more connected? How do we use our time with learners? Are we all guilty a bit of thinking if we just drill them enough, they'll get there? What do we think about accent? So I'm just going to come back to those questions as a list at the end, but I'm going to finish with this idea of your view on student autonomy. And I think in the global, online, interconnected world that we're all in now, are we actually in the process of letting our students run free in ways that, as linguists, we would be delighted to see? As teachers, as institutional curricula managers, how can we harness that whirlwind that could be active learners getting out there, developing a lot of multilingual expertise, just not the way we're teaching them? Very, very briefly, I'm going to skip through a lot, and I realize I've put too much content in, so apologies. I will skip quite fast. Really just to say how a lot of the ideas I've been expressing here have come out of my interest in what's happening with Mandarin. One of the problems in schools is how we see this decline in the traditional language mix, but actually Mandarin's on the rise in schools. And there's lots of interest in Chinese and other ab initio learners starting at university, where in a way they come with hopefully not too much baggage and ready to try out this new language. So, there is this rise in Mandarin, and there is an explosion in organizations, journals, research, events, groups of teachers, network can be learnt as in a variety of ways. And one of them you may know about is this Mandarin Excellence Project led by UCL. Now, Chinese is interesting because, as you may know, traditionally there's a sense of the very teacher-centered approach, which is inimical to what we were saying earlier about a more communicative approaches. There's all sorts of issues as to how Mandarin is currently tested. And it's seen as problematic in relation to perhaps more communicative goals. But Western learners come very clear that they want to be able to communicate and engage with Chinese speakers. So I think this is a really relatively fresh MFL area that we can try and bring good practice into. there's a lot of frustrations with the idea that teaching is simply drilling. And as I say, perhaps with more modern technology resources, there's opportunities here. Just to highlight the idea of how much good practice is already there, we've been doing work with our university learners in Leeds and other institutions, and we've been looking at learners through online settings such as MOOCs. And so, clearly there is this great interest in mastering Mandarin, and I think we can, as I say, just keep the bridge going between expectations from the teacher's point of view and understanding from a linguistic point of view how language is learned, to try and go into a fresher way of thinking about language learning. I'm just going to skip through briefly to finish with that. One of the, again, the sort of challenges with Mandarin is that, for very obvious historical reasons, there's been a rather strict focus on one version of Mandarin, but the reality, of course, is that the Chinese is an incredibly rich language family with many, many subgroups, and even non-Mandarin subgroups, what they call Fangyan, or the dialects, topolects spoken in all sorts of parts of the Chinese-speaking world. And of course, there's the issue in mastering scripts. So there's a rich literary cultural variety, and an over-narrow prescriptive view of Mandarin puts all that at risk. I'm going to finish but I'm going to finish with this question of, if even Chinese, or especially Chinese, has this variety, what is it that we as teachers and we as researchers into teaching need to do to try and harness all of that? So I'm just going to skip through now to the end to say thank you to the people who work with me on this, and to come back to the ideas of what you may want to think about in terms of language and learning, language teaching, and this notion of pluriglossia, that the more we think of different skills of language, different aspects of language use, different contexts of language use, the more we can see that language success may not necessarily be monolingual-like capacity in every domain, but the capacity to do some text speak in a language, the capacity to have a Skype chat or Zoom chat in a language, that's as valuable in many ways for the contemporary needs of language use as fully fledged in-depth mastery. So my final question to you is, how much more can linguistic or pedagogic research help to keep going with understanding these questions? Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Another really rich presentation, Claire, in a short space of time. So we'll go on to our final speaker now. Our final speaker is Robert Blackwood, Professor of Social Linguistics at Liverpool, and he is talking about linguistic landscapes in the city, multilingualism, semiotics, and language learning on the streets.
He would be if he could actually remember how to share his screen properly. Thank you, whilst I'm doing that. Thank you very much indeed, Naomi, and all the organisers for today's opportunities to talk through our work, and also for the chance to think about, and I can't see, is that being shared? Can you see that? Or...
Yeah.
Great. And also for a very slick organisation, which is far superior clearly to my own organisation in this. Today, I'm going to dwell very briefly on a specific aspect of something that we do at Liverpool, which is a second-year module using linguistic landscapes. And I'll talk about that very briefly in a second. But this is one of the ways in which we use the city effectively as a textbook for the ways in which to teach and to understand language and linguistics there. In some ways, that responds to the institution's very clear presentation of self as a civic institution. So it's about the ways in which we engage with Liverpool and what we see around us, and of course the ways in which we view multilingualism and are able to teach multilingualism from the perspective of the city in which we live. For those who don't know, the linguistic landscape is probably a sub-discipline of sociolinguistics. It's about looking at language, but not just language, so other meaning-making resources, icons, images, symbols, as we see them in the public space, and how that tells us something about the communities we belong to, the people we are, and how we interact with others. Sometimes it's sort of dismissed really as counting signs and trying to understand about multilingualism from the perspective a sort of quantitative approach. And there are those of us who still do this quantitative work, myself included. But as you can see, Malinowski in his very long quote there gives us a couple of hints of the different ways in which the linguistic landscape draws on work in pedagogy and literacy studies. It also got a strong ethnographic or sort of linguistic anthropology dimension to it, as well as those who are thinking about mixed methods. It's about understanding the things we see in the public space around us. How we take that through into the classroom or out beyond the classroom is through a module that's currently called Liverpool's Linguistic Landscape, Reading the City. The module's been running now for 6 years. And so we've had the opportunity to refine and nuance it and drop some of the more challenging aspects of it. But effectively, this is a module that is open to all second year students studying a modern foreign language within our department. As you can see, the list of languages there that we do there. And we have a teaching team of 5 who represent the languages of the students within the group. And as the module unfolds, some of the actual languages studies are privileged, depending on who's teaching it. Some of those are backgrounded. So there's a sense in which the students themselves become exposed to the languages that their peers are studying, even if they don't speak a word of Portuguese themselves. And I'll try and give us a reflection of the variety of the languages we touch on in the few minutes I've got left, although my pronunciation of some of the languages is a bit ropey, so please don't count on that aspect being particularly accurate. This is a very mixed approach to how we deliver this. So there are the traditional content lectures, they're sort of very didactic, where we talk about the kinds of philosophies and principles that underpin some of the schools of thought we use. Then there are the standard seminars which students do preparations for. The most exciting, I suppose, the thing that's different to all the other modules I teach on are the street-based classes, whereby we all leave the classroom and go down into Liverpool and choose a different part of the city to focus on a different aspect of the module. Teaching this during a pandemic has proved quite a challenge, as you would expect, since obviously we weren't in a position all to meet and all to go down. So what we have been able to do, and what you can see on the screen, but I'll spare you the narration, is that we've been down as academic staff and walked the route and recorded ourselves on this. Alas, not using TikTok. We're not quite that street, but we've recorded this and uploaded it for students to follow their way through this, giving them the opportunity when sort of COVID restrictions permit to go back and walk through the route we've done, rather than doing it collectively as a group. Usually we limit the groups to 10, so we're doing about 3 of these trips for each of the different aspects we look at. The one I'll just focus on very briefly is the one that I deliver, which is looking at questions of authenticity and commodification of languages. And this goes down a street in Liverpool, Bold Street, which is renowned for a very high sort of concentration of sort of ethnically badged restaurants. And you can see on the right there the route that we take as we go down Bold Street, just using sort of very basic Google map. And at each of the sort of interesting points, we focus on some particular aspect, and I'll talk about the 3 aspects in 2 seconds, but some particular aspect of learning that we can follow just by looking at, in this case, the restaurants that we encounter. So first bit of bad pronunciation coming up, there's La Parrilla, which is a Mexican restaurant on Bold Street. And one of the interesting things that La Parrilla has is a 15-meter mural that runs alongside the building. As you walk along it, you encounter all of these different kind of icons and images that we as Westerners are invited to consider to be Mexican. So you can see there a statuette of the Blessed Virgin Mary. You can see a bottle of tequila branded as La Parrilla after the restaurant, but there's also a Mexican reclining in a sombrero. There is a woman with a sort of Day of the Dead mask. There are all these other kind of images evoked to try and convey a sense of Mexicanness outside this. What we tried therefore to do is, using these real world examples on the streets of Liverpool, is to talk through what kind of dimensions of language and other learning we can do in these circumstances. So effectively, there are 3 different lines of inquiries we take. The first is thinking about how you can teach translation on the streets of Liverpool. So here we are at the top end of Bold Street, outside the Italian Club Fish. There's an Italian Club Pasta further down. The great thing about Italian Club Fish is, and you probably can't see it very clearly on the screen, is, but in the window, etched onto the window, on the left-hand side, sort of some of the food offered in English, and on the right in Italian. And so what we get students to do is just look and see, well, how do we relate fish and chips on the left to pesche e patate on the right? What has the translator done in trying to talk to us or to sell us calamari when in fact in Italian it's frittura di pesche? And so we talk about how these real life examples can evoke the idea of using foreignisms or domestication in terms of translation approaches as they see and pass through every day, or even if they are sort of wealthy enough to get to go to the Italian club fish. So that's translation, how we deliver that in the public space. Then there is the issue of semiotics. And because this is a linguistics module, it's not just language based, but we do draw on the languages we deliver. This is one example where we go down into Liverpool's gay quarter and think about how semiotics can be taught on the streets of Liverpool. Here we bring into the sort of teaching questions of geosemiotics. So understanding how various signs, symbols and emblems can make meaning, even if there's no particular language evoked there, but also how the actual place in which this happens ignites further meaning here. So here you can see just a very short excerpt from an extended essay. So the students are assessed in part by an extended project essay. And one of the students went back to the gay quarter to try and explore the extent to which it is an inclusive sort of district. It presents itself as very inclusive, but looking at the semiotics and the linguistic landscape, in fact, Will, the student there, found that it was actually new normativities were being sort of marshaled on the streets to make this a space for gay men, but thereby excluding, for example, from what is presented as inclusive, other parts of the LGBTQ+ community. So that's how we teach semiotics as part of this module. And then the third dimension is the teaching of languages. I'm not a Mandarin speaker, so I'm going to use an example that I know from a project in Auckland. And by a bit of advanced preparation, we as the tutors can find examples of languages as they're explored and presented in the public space, and then set a series of questions for the students to follow. So as I say, given some examples here from Mandarin, just to look at the kind of things that we invite students to think of. It's sort of echoing a little of what Claire said a few moments ago. We are training a bunch of highly prescriptive individuals. And so, for example, in the French restaurants that we go and stand outside en masse, students become very zealous in spotting mistakes or missing accents and missing diacritics. So this is part of the way in which we teach languages, using very much real-world examples on the streets of Liverpool. So trying to draw something back from all of that, one of the things that makes this module work is the fact that we are able to offer it to all of the subject areas that we have within modern languages here. But equally, each of us within the teaching team has a slightly different perspective in our own interests. So there are those of us who are translation specialists, or there are those of us who are more interested in semiotics or linguistics or multilingualism. So this kind of bringing these together means that over the course of the 6 years so far of the lifespan of the module, we've been able to refine it and draw out the different dimensions to use, as I say, to use Liverpool as the textbook that the students can actually walk through on a daily basis and encounter these. And one of the exciting things we've found is that, of course, what we're doing is equipping students to undertake their own extended and individual sort of undergraduate research work during the year abroad. So they are equipped with the skills that we then encourage them to apply whilst they're in their third year on their year abroad. So last year I supervised one of my tutees who looked at how users responded to the fairly striking presence of English in the gym that she used in Paris. So this is the ways in which they've already sort of opened their eyes to the idea of multilingualism and how individuals engage with that, and then thinking of the ways in which students and others can take this forward out into the public space. Sorry, I feel like I've gone very, very quickly there, but thank you very much.
Now, again, that was fantastic timing and another really rich presentation. I think we've seen some really interesting examples of engaging students with language, with multilingualism, with language learning. And on that note, I will introduce our respondent. So our respondent is Tony Chafer, who is Professor of French and African Studies at Portsmouth University. And he also, I think until quite recently, was president of the UK Council of Area Studies Association. So I will hand over to Tony for a response. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you, first of all, to Michelle, Claire and Robert for 3 really interesting presentations with plenty of food for thought there. It seems to me, in terms of thinking about the ways in which language as a discipline and language as an area of study, modern languages can be renovated. And I think there's 3 points and then perhaps a question or a problem that I'd like to briefly speak about. I think the first thing that comes out of the presentations for me is the point about language not being something that's fixed, not a given, that there are different versions of the language, that language is evolving. And students can be invited to study that, can be invited to look at the different versions of the language. And in so doing, they can develop puzzle solving, analytical and critical skills. So it seems to me that that's one area. Secondly, there's the area of what I would call critical discourse analysis. This is where we analyze the language in order to build the bridge between language skills and cultural contexts. In other words, how does language work in specific contexts? And this again is one way of moving away from the language as a kind of something that is univocal to something that is pluralistic. And I think that discourse analysis can be applied in all sorts of different contexts, because it can be discourse analysis of different types of texts, from political speeches to comedy programs, to also visual artifacts, learning to interpret those, learning how they operate as artifacts which carry meaning or a plurality of meanings. So discourse analysis, as I'm thinking about it here, includes both textual and visual object analysis. And I think the other thing that came out of the 3 talks was really, and I think this is a kind of crucial underlying theme in all the talks, is that language is not just a tool for communication, but an object of study in itself. Very often, I think, when non-linguists are making decisions about language and the usefulness of language study, and we talked a bit about this in the first session this morning, language is taken as a given. It's a tool for communication. But I think if you then move beyond that and take the language itself as an object of study, that then opens up new doors to engage new types of questions, to engage new students in new ways of thinking about language. And one other point, perhaps, that's worth making, and here there's a clear link with area studies, particularly in the new area studies. A key area of interest is the relationship between people and places, and how that relationship between people and places is formative of their identity. And of course, language plays a key role in that. So understanding the relationship between people and places, the interaction between people and places, and how that constitutes or can constitute their identity, and the role of language within that, I think, is again something. It's a place where linguistics has a lot to offer. To conclude, I suppose the question is, and it's the one that I think Claire raised, and I don't have an answer to it, but I'll just repeat it. It's the ongoing question of assessment, and if you're going to move away from language as a given, if you like, to language as an object of study, and if you're going to in your pedagogy, you're going to emphasize communicative abilities over, for example, such things as grammatical accuracy, then that raises various questions about assessment. And perhaps in the discussion, this is something that it would be interesting to hear people's different views on. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Really picked up on some of the really interesting points raised in the presentations, and I'm going to give the speakers a chance if they want to respond to any of the points that Tony raised. So if any of you would like to respond. I think Claire, did you?
Yes, I mean, yes. I think I would, just concur really that it just, it's in a way, we are our own worst enemies, because language is everywhere and multiple languages are even more everywhere. And so it's quite hard to find a common area where the needs of whether you're the learner or the teacher or the policymaker or the researcher, you can find this common intersection. But certainly I think the idea of keeping language cultural richness as one of the domains in which that scientific, systematic, linguistic, clicking into place that goes on, it is one of those areas of bridges. I think that would be a particularly valuable one, because my sense is that occasionally you get them over there who do the theory, and are looking at Michelle in our days with Anders and, formal syntax on the one hand. And then, you get people like Michelle who are doing this, and her colleagues who are doing this amazing job of bringing that system into a world of use and emphasis on variety and real world. And then, the people who are working with Robert and so on, and in that decoding of the richness of the linguistic landscape, see how it's then put into place. So, but I worry that we can see the value of these bridges. How do we get it out to the people who don't? And I think I'm very conscious that the group that we've managed to create today is amazing. And I missed the chance at the time to say thank you to the organisers. It is amazing. And I would really hope there could be some energy and some opportunities to think how we can make some change happen, Tony, as a result of what we've been talking about today.
Great. Did Michelle, did you want to?
I just want to say thanks. It was really, really nice commentary that, I think really touched on everything that we were saying. I think I was just going to mention that one of the questions that we asked the teachers that taught our mini courses in linguistics was, we asked them quite a few questions about, what barriers do you see to the inclusion of linguistics, in school teaching of languages? And many of them raised, the issue of, we don't want them to, get it wrong. We don't want to teach them about variation, and then they actually, miss out ne when they're actually speaking French. So I think there's a lot of sort of anxiety actually on behalf of teachers about, once we tell them that there's variation, how are we going to stop them from, speaking differently from the way that we want to speak? So I think it's a really big problem and a really big issue. And as exactly as you said, the issue is related to examination, the way assessment works, really, and that's where it has to change probably. But yeah, it was really interesting that nearly all of them said that the issue is really that there's a tension between, it's interesting and they're interested in learning about variation and they want to know about it and they like it, but we don't want them to actually produce some non-standard French in their French oral exam, for example. So yeah.
Thanks. And Robert, did you want to?
Yes, just thank you. Very, very briefly, the sort of the line that leapt out for me from what you were saying, Tony, was the idea of the bringing back in people and places. And I think we've all seen over the course of the 20th century how the move of language teaching, as we've seen it, has moved away from the very traditional philological roots to bring in people, and we're all aware of the communicative dimension of that. What I think is the obvious and logical next stage is this activation of place and seeing language in place, and how that echoes the variation that we're thinking about. And we encounter this, I'm sure most people have, who, for example, in the delivery and teaching and assessing of French in final year, when you have students who return from North America, from Quebec, and bring all of the sort of the rich variety that they've acquired there, and then we become very sort of constraining and say, no, it's back to metropolitan France for you in terms of how we do it. So this connection that we need to draw between the language, the people, and the place is something that I think all three of us have touched on, and try and therefore take this forward into the ways in which we deliver, and ultimately to address some of the comments in the chat, assess at the end.
Great. I'm just going to summarize some of the chat. So if anyone wants to pose any further questions, I'll pick these up. And also it's easiest if you also want to comment or pose a question, do raise your virtual hand as well. But I just want to pick up on one theme that's coming through, which is this heritage language question, heritage speakers. So people who, I think the question was originally posed to Claire in response to her question of whether the Mandarin students were predominantly heritage speakers learning the language. But I think there's interesting questions here, which connects also maybe to the themes we came up with this morning about the relationship between community languages and modern languages. And I think Michelle and Claire, from the school's perspective of what role those students have, is interesting. But I also think, Robert, there's a question about engaging with the multilingual landscape, which is also engaging with heritage speakers who, create signs in the landscape. And so I wondered if anyone wants to respond a bit more about that question of heritage speakers and the relationship. Does anyone?
Oh, you go ahead, Claire.
Well, I was really going to throw it out to all of you, the rest of you, because I think you may well have experience of working with heritage, and again, this may be a term that people interpret differently. And Michelle, I think perhaps you've got more knowledge of this, perhaps.
I was just going to say that I think it's interesting. So so there's when schools talk about, they usually call them native speakers actually on exam boards. They see it as kind of a problem because there's a perception amongst teachers as well that the native speakers come in and get all the top grades, and because of the way that grades are awarded, that prevents non-native speakers from getting a top grade, and that is one of the things that they think puts people off studying languages. So they're seen as a problem, but actually when you actually talk to heritage speakers, so I've got a PhD student working on French heritage speakers, you find that actually their experience is very different. So they're very insecure about their knowledge of the language. It's not their main language. They've grown up in English, they've worked really hard to learn how to read and write in French. The teachers are annoyed because they can't spell in French, because obviously they haven't been to French school, so they've got to catch up all that stuff. So I think it's a really complicated issue, which it doesn't have an easy answer. And I think it's, I do think that we should try to kind of think about it in a deeper way than just kind of the way that the exam boards do, where they had an investigation to see, do the native speakers get all the top marks? And the problem they found in that investigation, if anyone's read it, was they couldn't define what a native speaker was. There was no way of defining it because, it isn't something we can define. We know that from linguistics. So in our project, we've tried to engage with people who identify themselves as heritage speakers. And the main thing that we found is that they're very interested to learn about variation because it contextualizes their own language. So, they speak a variety at home, which is not the same as what they're taught at school. And their teacher's telling them, oh, that's wrong. And they're thinking, well, that's what my aunt says and my mum. So, why is it wrong? So we had an event for students whose families come from Francophone Africa that Damien Hall also spoke at. We gave a very nice presentation at. And they really liked, seeing examples of, grammatical variation in African varieties of French, and seeing that it was just, you know, just examples of variation rather than the fact that it was wrong. So I think it's a really interesting subject, and sorry, I've spoken a lot, so I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about it.
Robert, did you have any comments on that, or are you?
If I may, the speech version and the University of Leeds. Oh, sorry. We have Russian heritage speakers occasionally, and I think I would tend to agree with the phrase which was said before, that they're still learners, and as any learners, they're divided. They have different attitudes to learning and different strategies for learning. And yes, I would agree that very occasionally some come in wanting an easy degree. But a lot of them, like has just been mentioned, feel quite insecure about what they say because they learned it not in an academic environment. And they feel in the academic environment that they say a lot of things wrong. And some of them take it on board and sort of work quite hard on collocations and usage, which they actually, a lot of the time, they might not necessarily know. And to expand their vocabulary, to learn academic vocabulary, to do well in the assessment, they actually have to work hard.
Thanks for that. I've just spotted that I think there are also a lot of questions in the chat about the GCSE, but I see the speakers and other people have really responded and provided further resources, so we may not revisit that. But I did spot someone else raise their hand, I think G. McCrory. Yeah, if you want to unmute yourself. Should be able to.
Mute. Hi, thank you to all three speakers. That was really interesting and really stimulating. Just start with anecdotally, when I first went to France, age 12, after a year and a half of learning French, I was actually furious when I discovered that they didn't say je ne sais pas. And I've felt for a very long time that in modern languages and also in English, what is overlooked is a clear, explicit discussion with learners of the differences between spoken and written language in all languages. I just think this is massively overlooked and has the potential for lots of really kind of interesting lessons with kids. And yeah, that's my view. I don't know, I'd be interested to hear other people's views on that.
Did any of the speakers have any responses to that?
Michelle's nodding.
Well, yeah, one of the things, of course, we see now in digital discourse is the actual writing down of spoken ways of producing language. So it makes it much more straightforward to actually engage with that from a student's perspective. So we can actually present, evidence of how spoken language is written down, look at the ways in which these two modes are merging. And I cut off Michelle, she was going to say something as well.
I was just agreeing really generally, yeah, and I think that's a really good point as well, that the rise of social media and online written communication has totally changed the dynamic, actually the differences. But yeah, it's definitely something that we try to address in our introductory course, and it's something that the teachers brought up as an issue actually for the co-creation materials. So we spent quite a lot of time talking about that, and we particularly in relation to languages like French, where the written form is so different from the spoken form, and talking to the students about why that is, because it's representing the phonology of French from a few hundred years ago, basically. So things like that, yeah.
But I don't want to hog the space, but I mean at the level of syntax as well. I mean, I spent a long time as a learner of French, thinking it was only the French that have these spoken forms of can't remember the correct linguistic term right now, but of fronting a noun and then using the pronoun. It took me ages to realise that the English did it as well. And I think there's a lot to be said for looking at our own language, anybody's own language, in terms of the differences between spoken and written language, not just a new language that one happens to be learning.
Yeah, really interesting. On the digital, what Robert was saying as well about the digital is whether it's making students more relaxed. I had the chance to watch primary language class recently using Zoom. And, you know, writing used to be so intimidating, but all these kind of 7-year-olds typing in Spanish in the chat, that seems quite different from when we learnt languages, whereas writing was always something quite intimidating. So I think there's a lot of interesting developments, but I won't take up too much time. I think we've got another question from Richard Hudson, if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hello. Very interesting discussion. To what extent do you think that the typical French teacher or German teacher is actually prepared intellectually to, by their training and their experience, to actually handle these linguistic questions?
I used to do a little bit of teaching in this, you know, the move to initial teacher training in schools, and almost everybody I came into contact with said that they were interested in modern foreign language learning because they'd studied MFL at university and it was literature. And when I was explaining about sort of these principles of SLA, you know, if only we'd known more, if only we'd known more. So no, I think that, you know, there is a really rich opportunity to try and embed this kind of thing into MFL degree programs or teach training in whatever guise, I'm sure.
If I could just, I was really struck, having been an unwilling participant in homeschooling primary school children. I found that through what my children were learning, that the primary school teachers were very highly equipped in terms of meta language and the ability to explain complex sort of linguistic phenomena to very young children. So there is clear evidence, at least from my very limited experience, that there is a way in which teachers, certainly from the lower years, early years curriculum upwards, are able to do this. Whether they have the space and the time and the opportunities is another question. But I certainly wouldn't worry about their ability to do so, based on just saying what I've just seen.
Yeah, just to add to that, so we tried to recruit, for our mini courses, we tried to recruit teachers who had some background in linguistics, because we didn't have any money at the time to train them, or you know, online stuff wasn't really happening at that point. So but we did recruit some teachers who didn't have any background in linguistics, and looking at the, you know, their reaction, they did struggle a bit more with teaching the materials, it's true, and the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, was one sticking point that I think it's something that's pretty simple once you have learned about it, but it's sort of somehow difficult, you know, it's a bit scary when you see it for the first time. So I think there is, yeah, there are some, there would have to be some training, as Claire said, like maybe within the PGCE, but I don't think it's, you know, most of the stuff is pretty intuitive, actually. You know, the fact that language, as G was saying, that, you know, spoken language is different from written language, we all know this anyway. It's just that when you learn a second language, no one tells you, and so you don't expect it to be true in some. I mean, I remember as well that having those realizations, and yeah, so I think it would require some training for sure, but I don't think it's as, you know, difficult to train people. I mean, that's something we're trying to do. We're trying to engage with PGCE programs and also going into schools, and generally people find it pretty interesting. If they're interested in language, they like to learn about language. So.
But this is really the subject knowledge that we're talking about. It shouldn't be left to the PGCE courses to provide that information. And I'm just wondering to what extent the foreign language departments in universities are actually willing and able to provide this the kind of training that you're talking about here.
I think that's a very important point for us to end on, is thinking about our role. Most of us working in higher education, what is our role in taking these messages? And we've seen some examples of people who are doing that, but how do we kind of strengthen in terms of what we can provide to schools in terms of resources and training? And on that note, there were some other questions in the chat, but I think it's best that we conclude the session just so we can start the next session promptly and give you a bit of time to grab a cup of tea or something similar. But thanks so much to our speakers for such rich presentations, and yeah, really interesting discussions all through this morning. I'm really looking forward to our final session, which I'm sure will further these discussions. And just to say, if the speakers of that session can either stay on the call or rejoin us at least 5 minutes before the next session. That would be really helpful so we can make sure you're all set up. Everyone else, we will reopen the waiting room and put you back in there just when we get to setting up, but you will be let back in, and obviously you can continue the conversation on the chat. So yeah, thanks so much to our speakers, and I think everyone in the comments.
We'll make a start. Seeing that we have little time, it's best to jump straight in. So welcome back to this last session of today's conference, and it's been really, really valuable and so interesting so far. So looking forward to this last leg of it. Just briefly introduce our first speaker, Charles Burdett. Charles is the director of the IMLR, professor in Italian studies. He was PI of the AHRC project Transnationalizing Modern Languages, and he's one of the series editors of the Transnational Modern Languages book series, which has appeared at Liverpool University Press. So Charles will kick us off talking about transnational modern languages.
Thank you, Gordala. Okay, time is short, so I'm going to be reading notes. So one of the aims of this symposium is to address the interface between research and pedagogy. There may be periods in which it is possible to talk about research as separate from teaching. But in the light of the current situation, this is not one of those periods. It is more important than ever before that we consider the context in which research occurs, its pedagogical implications, and its impact upon the disciplinary field. Building on the work of Translating Cultures and Auri, for example, this is a very good moment to use research initiatives as a means of addressing the identity and purpose of our subject area. If we want to see growth in modern languages, then it is vital that we define the subject area and the role that it occupies within education and within public discourse. We have nothing whatsoever to gain from arguing among ourselves. Thus, it is the view of the project TML, of which more in a moment, and of the IMLR, that we should speak of modern languages, and we do need to think about the name, as a capacious disciplinary field that encompasses distinctive but overlapping methodological approaches that range from literary studies to linguistics, area, and cultural studies, but that are bound, and this is crucial, by an emphasis on language, on mobility, increasingly on the transnational, on the translational, and of course, one could go on. The essential point is that what binds us together is of crucial importance. Foregrounding this interpretation allows us to speak with greater clarity and unity. It makes it easier to argue for the role that we need collectively to occupy. It enables us to see how initiatives to decolonize the curriculum can inform one another. An example of this being the recent conference organized by Emanuela Santos and Joe Ford, one of the most attended conferences in the recent past at the IMLR, and to pursue postgraduate training. This was referred to earlier on in the day. Our postgraduate training is, of course, very strongly related to the development of the disciplinary field. It's led by Naomi Wells, and this is just the first 4 sessions in term 2. It also enables us to think and act, and that was a point that has been made numerous times in today's discussion, on the relationship between modern languages at schools, at universities, and beyond. want to talk a little bit now about TML and TML global challenges. And as I do so, I stress the point that I am talking very much as a we, the researchers and communities that were involved in the projects Transnationalizing Modern Languages and Transnationalizing Global Challenges. The projects brought together teams of researchers and practitioners to address key issues in language and culture education, starting from the forms of mobility that define the development of modern Italian cultures across the globe. TML engaged with cultural associations, schools, policymakers, individuals in an exploration of cultural memory, educational practices, and carrying out work in the UK, Italy, South America, Australia, Ethiopia, Tunisia, the United States, and Namibia. Charles Forsdick referred earlier to the work in schools in Edinburgh and the role that played in thinking about the development of the project as a whole. The idea was to take insights from the project and to bring those, especially with the work that we did with the University of Namibia, to contribute to reframing how we think about modern languages as a disciplinary field. The idea is that I think many of us would agree upon this, and this is in part the purpose of AMLUK, that is of itself located in a context that, as I began by saying, stretches back over a considerable period of time. But modern languages does need a better narrative and a stronger sense of a coherent disciplinary field that is, of course, composite, porous, and capacious. It needs to move away from the idea of academics working in entirely separate fields. It needs to ensure that the subject area as a whole is more attuned to practices of human mobility and cultural exchange. And it needs to embrace a research, teaching, and impact agenda that is more global in its focus, stressing the contingency of any cultural formation and seeing an individual area as a pathway to developing a more global consciousness. It is important to add that the pressure to reform derives from the undergraduate and postgraduate student body, from what we see happening around us in the current situation, and for the need to decolonize the curriculum by considering in depth its objects of studies, its methodologies, and its applications. The question of application has been a strong one throughout today's proceedings. This has led, this is just one image from the work that we have been doing over years, it has led to the book series, of which there was an event in the summer. The book series emerged from the sharing and developing of ideas through workshops, conferences, activities of the project. The series intended to explore how one can move beyond any reliance of the nation state, how the study of the transnational, of course, incorporates the national as an epiphenomenon within it, how the study of language and culture always necessarily has to be inseparable, how modern languages can foreground the coming together of methodological approaches in the study of language and culture and their mobility and dynamism, which does not, of course, make us, it makes us far more aware of inequalities, the legacy of inequalities and their persistence in the present. The blog posts of the series give a good idea of the volumes that have appeared so far and how they are anchored by the text Transnational Modern Languages, a Handbook, edited by Derek Duncan and Jenny Burns, which we hope will be open access and which will be forthcoming this year. This is a key anchoring text within the series, multiple authorship, of course. It sets out, what it sets out to do is to provide relatively short but incisive introductions to key concepts within modern languages study. I'll just use the sound cloud that we have referred to before. The purpose is to enable students to develop a critical vocabulary, to see the interrelation of areas and objects of study, to think transnationally from the very start and perhaps before of their university careers. The presentations that we've heard so far have often referred to the breaking down of boundaries between the language classroom, the outside world, and the processes of meaning making that are there. But a structured vocabulary, such as a handbook aims to produce, is something that we regard as an extremely useful resource for the teaching of modern languages. In the individual books themselves, the series is intended to be student-focused. It's intended to be a resource from the first year of university onwards. It's intended not to be complete in itself, but to be an opening onto a mode of study and to bodies of scholarship. The texts in the series are intended to interact one with another. The series is also necessarily intended to be an expanding series. We call Russian studies, Spanish studies, and so forth. The idea, in a sense, is not to see the idea of a national terminology as anything other than contingent, and indeed as something that begins to disappear once one begins to explore the fabric of what we understand by a cultural or linguistic formation. The idea is that it provides a mode of analysis that can contribute to current debates on inclusivity and diversity. We hope also in the near future to be commissioning and publishing texts on Arabic studies, East Asian studies, international Black studies, environmental humanities, and I hope also English studies in a coherent and connected approach that provides a vocabulary with which to define what we do within the disciplinary field and also its applications, rationale and purpose, but also it is intended to be not complete in itself, of course, but a contribution to the development of modern languages and its explanation both within a university ecology and beyond. The idea is that it is grounded in the multilingual and multicultural experience of the communities that modern languages serves. It includes a concentration on movement across time and space of people, practices, ideas, as they have shaped the humanly constructed world and its embedding in the wider natural world. It also includes the examination of the role in mobility, as I said, in perpetuating inequalities that continue to haunt the present and compromise the future. It also is intended to provide a way of contributing, I stress, to taking modern languages outside the language classroom. It is born of a research experience where pedagogy was at its heart, and it aims to play a role in thinking how modern languages reflects the present, but also aims to construct futures. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Charles. So this emphasis on transnationalizing is, of course, a way of carrying on the conversation about non-fixity, mutability that we had about language and about inclusivity. So I think that fits in very nicely with what we have been discussing so far. I hand over straight on to Carmen Herrero. Carmen is the Spanish section lead at Manchester Metropolitan University. She's the director of FLAME, the research group for film, languages and media in education. And she's also the co-founder and co-director of FILTER, the Film in Language Teaching Association. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can find it before it was there. So hopefully it will be there. No. Can you see it?
Mhm.
No?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I was saying before, I'm glad that I am in the last group, because many of the things I'm going to say are going to resonate with some of the issues that have been mentioned before. So I'm going to be presenting about a few projects that we've been involved in the last years. And I say we because this is part of a group, particularly Isabel van der Schendel. And I think curricular content should be continuously revised in order to find ways for providing an attractive and inspiring curriculum for current and future students, as we've been mentioning just now. And I think it's also important to consider popular forms of culture like films, graphic novels, games that are probably more popular with our students than classic literature. And don't get me wrong, because I am, very much in favor of literature, but I think we should take another kind of approach. So we can have here some recommendations, particularly to consider new pedagogical approaches, which is what we are doing here, but also thinking about an understanding of intercultural competence and the importance of culture, but also to think about the place where we live and the way we work. So what I'm going to present here is the project New Approaches to Transmedia and Language Pedagogy that was supported by Cross-Language Dynamics, and it's been going on for a few years now. And the first part of the project was the teacher training project, which was to focus on teacher training and build on relevant practice and research in the fields of film, visual, and multimodal literacies applied to language learning and teaching. And we carry out this mainly through the FILTA Association, which have almost 5,000 members, not only for Spanish, but French, Arabic, Mandarin, Italian. Is a multilingual community of practice. And the aim was to evaluate current practices, curriculum requirements for teacher training, both for secondary and higher education. And from this information and from the series of workshops and insights that we carry out, we focus on several areas. One, it was the development of intercultural competence. The second one was critical thinking. And the third one was visual literacy. And we were working with also teachers and schools like Hubert College. And we also expanded what we tested mainly with French and Spanish, with Portuguese in using film creatively in the language classroom. The results were materials that we share, the same, all the materials that we create for the different insets are all open and accessible for everybody. So continuing with what we were doing there, we got a few practical implications, but I think some of them are being said today about the lack of time for teachers to create resources, the lack of space for the teachers to be able to implement new things, and also the needs of training, which was one of the key things that we were trying to encourage. The way we did it was to use resources which could be applicable to any language by using short films with no dialogue. So basically the materials were useful for any other languages and also for every possible level that we can think. So the following continuation of the project, the second part was the transmedia in education, the new approaches to transmedia and language pedagogy. And it was just to think about something that Henry Jenkins has been working on the terms of participatory culture, which explained the growth of user-generated content, distributed cognition, and particularly collective intelligence. So the idea was to develop this kind of new literacy strategies in education and applies to language learning. So for us, it was important to think about transmedia storytelling or transmedia narrative. So the way stories are told across different media. So films and television series, books, novels, video games, and making use of all the affordances offered in each media. So something that can start as a novel can be then expanded into a TV series and then become a game. And we wanted to use this because this is the way our students are being engaged nowadays. So if a few years ago I was asking them, which films did you watch? They probably will have a few when they started in year one. But if I ask them, which series have you been watching? They have a wide range, and some of them have said, well, I've been watching La Casa de Papel 4 times, all the series. So they are watching more than ever, and they go from different ways. So we needed to use these elements. And I think as a result of the COVID outbreak, media consumption has increased, and the streaming services, YouTube, video sharing sites are just part of the primary media across all generations. So we also were thinking about how include and arrange all this with the materials that we were already creating. So that's why in the last part, we were using already multi-literacies, multimodality. We wanted to increase this transmedia storytelling and transmedia narrative. And we did it in very different ways. Some of the things that we were doing were projects that started with a project run by my colleague Isabel on my French Film Festival, supported by Uni France, but we didn't have the equivalent of Spanish, and we did it with my Spanish Film Festival, which was to create a competition for schools to be able to get some training about visual literacy, critical thinking, and critical media, and then apply to creating a field review. So as an example of what we did to expand this one in the transmedia, more recently, last year, we decided also that after doing that part, which was mainly a written field review, that the students chose their favorite short film, we asked them to create a video review working in a group. So it was the moving from one media to the other. And another example that we've been now expanding of this idea of moving from being only consumers to being producers, which is called prosumers, to be able to generate and share media content in different types and levels of complexity, we decided to expand this also into higher education. So the result is a project called Transmedia Practices in Higher Education. And again, the idea was to generate open educational resources for students by students. We were mentioning before about assessment, how we don't want them to think about it's only about assessment and passing the year and then move on. I was very interested in the idea of reusing assessments. And this is what we did. After the students finish the unit, we think, can you do something with what you have learned? Can you put this into practice and share it so the knowledge that you got passed to somebody else? And this is what we've been doing with the samples that you have there, which are shared in MMUTube. You can open it to everybody, so it's open for across the whole world. Another of my students, Jack, wanted to share what he learned of doing the dissertation, the independent research project, and he created a series of podcasts because he thought that was the best way, with interviews, to share the knowledge of the tips and techniques of doing a great independent research project. So I think the key theme for this project, it was really to bring the experiences of the new generation, the millennial and generation set, and their culture, to create transmedia projects that have the opportunity to innovate, but also to use the language that they are going to be using, when they go to the real world to work. They will be asking to do this kind of activities. And really to broaden the views of literacies in language teaching and pedagogy, to bring these different media, to focus also on plurilingual perspectives, and as well as doing a kind of more interactive use of the knowledge that the student acquired during the years. So creating different artifacts, podcasts, blogs, and videos. And we are doing this as an example with with all the units, but particularly with 2 units in the final year. One is called Shifting Borders in Latin America and Spain. So we work with presenting in different ways. And the other one, which is the one we're currently doing for the first time, is called Transnational and Transmedia Practices in Latin America and Spain. And we work with creating blogs, and also we work with series, TV series, as well as films, as well as other novels. So I hope this gives you an idea of the opportunities that the new media practices can have and open up for all of us, and the way it can be getting students from secondary to higher education involved and being more of a prosumers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carmen. That was a great presentation. And what a great project, starting with the student experience and then really boosting and supporting their creativity. Wonderful. The Janice Carruthers has agreed to respond to this panel, and Janice is Professor of French Linguistics at the Queen's University, Belfast, and she was Leadership Fellow in Modern Languages with the HRC 2017 to 2020. Janice.
Thanks very much, Gudula, and thanks to everyone at the IMLR for inviting me to participate, and to all the speakers, and of course in this session, Charles, Carmen and Elizabeth, thank you very much. I think it's been a really important discussion today about our disciplinary identity, about its porous boundaries, about its relationship to other disciplines, but also about the relationship between research and teaching. That's obviously been at the heart of what we've been talking about. One challenge I think that's been evident throughout the day and in this session is how we manage, I suppose, as a discipline to join the dots between the sort of innovative thinking that is clearly taking place and has been for the last number of years in modern languages, and the sorts of structural and recruitment issues that we face, and just how we make that all join up. And I'll come back to that in a moment, just with respect to this particular session. So in responding to the literature and culture session, I am very aware that this is undoubtedly the area of our discipline of modern languages that has the largest critical mass by far of scholars, researchers in a UK Irish context. It is unquestionably the largest field. And all 3 of these presentations struck me as addressing areas of really recent and new development. Recent because they are developments that I'm thinking, for example, of Charles's project in transnationalizing modern languages, which he's been working on now, since I guess 2015, 2016. So they're not all entirely new, but they are recent and emerging developments in the field. And it seems to me that they're all ones which are grafted on, if you like, to the core literary cultural part of the discipline, and which have also benefited from and dialogued with, if you like, post-colonial studies, visual cultures, etc. And that came through strongly, I think, in the presentations as well. They invite us, the 3 presentations today, I think, which were absolutely excellent, invite us to think, I think, both about the object of study and about our approaches. And in terms of the object of study, I mean, in Carmen's case, it's asking us to reflect on the nature and the number of media that we are looking at. And the question, I'm thinking of the term Steve used this morning of media literacy, to rethink what we're offering there in terms of media literacy. I know from TML that they have worked with a huge range of cultural assets and cultural artifacts right across that project. And in Elizabeth's case, she's raising huge questions, huge ethical questions, not just around the choices we make about what we study, but also very much around how we do it. So we're thinking about the object of study, but we're also thinking about methodologies and approaches. Some of that is, well, all of it is both theoretical and practical. So for example, in TML, how conceptually we place concepts like migration at the center of modern languages. And thinking particularly of Carmen and Elizabeth's presentations, some very practical issues around pedagogy, you know, how we allow language learners to be creative and autonomous, how you create new resources that can be used to implement the sorts of ideas you have, how you can empower colleagues to decolonize their curriculum, you know, and actually the practicalities of how that can be done. I'm also very struck by the extent to which the three presentations engage with huge issues outside the academy. I mean, they're very obvious issues, but it's something that was very striking about all three of them. One being the movement of people, one being the impact of the pandemic on our consumption of different media, and one being the question of revisiting and I suppose reconceiving how we discuss colonial pasts and colonial presents. So I was very, very struck by the relationship between the three presentations and really hot issues outside the academy. And I just wanted to finish off really with a couple of questions. I mean, perhaps not direct questions, perhaps they're just challenges maybe to feed into the discussion. One is, everything we've done today has talked about, I guess, modern languages as a capacious field, to use Charles's word, and a holistic approach to modern languages that doesn't necessarily prioritize a particular subfield. And I suppose one of the challenges is, how do we do that in a context in our discipline where we have, as Elizabeth mentioned, precarity with a number of many early career researchers. We have, simply being realistic here, we have contraction in the sector. And we are talking very much, and rightly so today, and that's one of the things that's been most exciting about it. We're talking about broadening, expanding, etc. And it's just, how do we address that challenge? So that's one question. And the other, which is, I guess, related to it, is if we go back in the lives of the young people who come to university, and this has come up with the other areas as well, in area studies and in linguistics, how do we begin to diversify and decenter the canon and bring in other media, broaden their media literacy, etc., further back in the curriculum? And I know that you've touched, one of the things I liked very much about your presentations was the question of your involvement in actually providing resources, which is wonderful. But I suppose the challenge here is that, again, a bit like higher education, we're talking about expanding horizons, which is wonderful. But I'm very conscious of the fact that developments further back, particularly in the light of current GCSE review, that's not necessarily the direction of travel. So how do we take forward these kinds of ideas, both in higher education and in post-primary, given some of the challenging constraints that we have around us? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Janice. These are big questions, but I think it's a very good start for discussion. First of all, maybe handing this back to the speakers, if you would like to respond to Janice.
I have the privilege of wrapping things up, so I'll leave space for the other two speakers.
Well, I think it's quite important what you said about linking to what we are going to be receiving, hopefully. And I think both in the case of my colleague Isabel and myself, we work with schools, with teachers and with the students from GCSE to year 12, year 13. And we are always surprised of how well introducing different films and forms of media works with them. We have been doing activities with local cinema home here in Manchester for many years. This year will be the first time that we'll be doing online, so we don't know how it's going to be working. But it's surprising to see how they react to a wide range of films, not only the ones that that you've been mentioning that are part of the curriculum, but really to bring them other ones that probably are quite difficult for them to watch in another way, and opening them, a whole new world. And I think that enthusiasm is something that can really attract the students to study languages. But at the same time, I think it's very important to support teachers, including the trainees. This year, we were very lucky to be able to offer a workshop organized by the Association for Language Learning. And that was great to have almost 300 people registered there, particularly trainees, PGC students, but also from other parts of the world. So what we are seeing is this resonates everywhere in the whole world. It's not only for us. And I think training teachers is very important. I'm not sure how much is being done already, and looking for all the opportunities inside and outside the classroom to bring the cultural and multilingual diversity that we have.
Thank you very much, both. The chat has thrown up again, the request to engage with the GCSE review, and that is really a practical way in which we can influence structure, or at least we can, have our voice heard in changing structures. So just like to reiterate that. And then I'd like to think again about what Janice was saying, where the main points or the focus of the conversation today has been. And I very much agree with her analysis. And what we've seen is this: it's absolutely crucial to relate to societal issues, to the real world, to the world outside the classroom. It is absolutely crucial to develop critical capacities, to help students understand that we are not dealing with contents that are fixed, but that are, that have a variety in them, that are changeable. And then the one thing that I think has come out very clearly in Carmen's contribution, but it has also been mentioned several times before in the linguists panel, for instance, is that aspect of creativity. And I think maybe we should underline that a bit more also. Creativity is a huge bonus in our field. It's again something that students of all ages will gladly engage with, and that is something we can very much push in our various ways of adopting and teaching modern languages. So I wonder if anyone wants to add something to that, or add a different field that they feel was really strongly represented here, but maybe not discussed enough.
Maybe I can add. I'm always so glad to work with, with the students, sometimes Erasmus students that are coming and they want to do materials. And I always so happy to see the new ideas that they bring to, this part of the creation, as well as the way the students see the films and the way they interpret it is absolutely wonderful. And I also wanted to add something else about this holistic approach. We also organize a festival called Beyond Babel. It's a multilingual film festival, and which is a good way of bringing people that are learning languages, as well as community speakers. And I remember particularly in one of the films, a family came because the mother said they wanted the children to learn more about the culture, and that's part of the idea. I think is opening up as many opportunities as we have in the classroom and outside the classroom, formal and informal way of engaging the communities in the love of languages in whatever form comes. And that's why films is a really good way, but as I say, there are many other ways, and we need to sometimes get out of our comfort area and so on, and try to explore other areas, which is challenging because you are always kind of afraid of crossing, this area and not so much of an expert. If something I learned over these years is not to be so much afraid of crossing and trying new things and looking at other different approaches. And this has been always done by, new teachers, new voices. And I think this is great also to be part of a community of practice like in Filter, which give you a lot of ideas and suggestions and contacts as well.
Thank you. And it's exactly that, isn't it? The losing the fear of crossing these boundaries. So really what, in many ways, the practices we use do already incorporate area studies, modern languages, linguistics in a way. But, it just is something that we need to bring out a little bit more clearly, perhaps. Charles, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on the subject of creativity, I mean, I think one of the very interesting things about the amount of work that has been promoted over recent years through AURI, through Translating Cultures, through the Global Challenges Research funding, which the freezing of which is a terrible thing, is that it has actually promoted the ability to work with a very extensive range of cultural producers in different parts of the world. And the question for that is how we bring that sense of creativity and connection into the main body of our teaching and our thinking about teaching and the way that we go forward with it.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I think there are no questions in the chat that directly relate to the papers that we've just listened to. So I would like to thank our speakers again very much. And I think I'll hand over to Charles for the final words and possibly final discussion of this symposium.
Thank you, Godala. I'll just say a few words and then leave a little bit of space for last thoughts by people. Of course, what I want to do is thank very strongly my colleagues at the IMLR, Jenny Stubbs, Kathy Collins, for their work in the organisation, and for Gordala for really bringing things together over a lengthy period of time. And of course, the excellence of the organisation of IMLR is something that I really profoundly appreciate, as we all do. Just picking up on some of the things that we talked about today, one of the things I think we can say, and this is where it has been mentioned, is the need for transformation. Elizabeth, in her talk just now, was talking about transformation must be structural. It also has to be, we need to be thinking about how we talk about change and how we follow through change. How we think about the way in which what we do can be transformative. So that is something I think that certainly to take away. And we were discussing this morning with a short meeting of AMLUK, the research agenda and the changes that are happening to that. And I am inviting Christopher Smith from the AHRC to talk to us as a community about funding developments and the role of the AHRC going forward. and one thing is to say he will very, very happy to do that, and he wants the emphasis to be not on decline, but on transformation. And I think that's something that we can very much embrace and see as part of our thinking going forward. Which brings to another point that has been made throughout today, and that is how we seek to build bridges. A number of the papers, as Janice said just now, are all about how one takes what we do beyond the classroom. Another thing that people talked about in the session before that was the relationship between people and place, and not taking language as a given, but as something that is constitutive of both place and identity. The question then is how we build those bridges and how we provide resources for one another to continue that. It is absolutely necessary that we articulate with the teaching of languages post-primary, to use Janice's phrase, but even at perhaps before then and certainly beyond higher education. And I think pooling of those resources, but also thinking about how we can develop them further as a community is something that we have to do with increasing urgency and build on the platform that research initiatives have built very successfully in recent and less recent years. The question of what training university sector should be offering to schools, not only at secondary level, but also before that, is something that we do need to take away and think very seriously about. As indeed is what has been something that we have talked about throughout, and that is the connection with civil society and with the creative world. And very much in thinking about how it is that one continues of necessity the processes of diversifying and decolonizing. This brings me to my last point, again, summing up some of the things that we have been talking about, and that is, what is the role of AMLUK? This is a symposium organized by AMLUK, and I do think, especially from the morning session that we had just before this, about what use do we make of AMLUK? It is the natural interlocutor of the IMLR. The IMLR will be changing over time, well, actually over a very short period of time. It is very much intending to do what it has always done, but place its foot on the accelerator on making sure that the events, workshop, other events that we organize are embedded in our practice and that they participate in the momentum in making sure that we facilitate research by increasing its resonance, its audience, and ensuring that we can do something about problems that we do face, and indeed the issue of the precariousness of many of our colleagues' jobs. That is an issue of a very great concern. So thinking about AMLUK, its role, and how we take this further, and how that is related to what the IMLR does, is absolutely vital. And I'm going to conclude by just mentioning forthcoming events. We are going to be organising an event with Bilingualism Matters on community language. We will, of course, be taking forward the initiatives on decolonising the curriculum that have been referred to throughout the day, the work of Emanuele Santos and Joe Ford. We will be also making sure that we organise throughout our regional and national 4 nations, that is, programme of making sure that we are not as London focused as, well, we avoid being London focused. So those are some of the things. In the immediate future, we are organising 2 events on the effects of COVID in a transnational perspective on the 22nd and 27th of April, and we will be disseminating information about that in the very near future. So I'll stop there with some of the things that we can take away and leave space for people to make any comments or suggestions of how we can take what we talk about and embed it in the way that we think and act. Anyone like to come in with some thoughts? Bearing in mind that time is short. Claire.
Can I just ask a quick question and say thank you to the three speakers, the last two speakers. They were really interesting papers. And Charles, you talked about the importance of transnational research feeding into our teaching. It's likely to do so increasingly. Elizabeth then picked up that there is an issue about incoming students not being so familiar with our decolonizing and decentering agenda. So I'm just wondering, as somebody who is producing materials in this field, are there dedicated spaces where people are sharing materials that they're producing, research-led materials, as they come available for A-level or GCSE or even earlier? I'm working with some people on Key Stage 3, for instance. There's a new curriculum coming up in Wales that's going to be entirely interdisciplinary, and there's a space for languages in that. I just wondered really whether we're all doing our own kind of engagement with schools, or whether I'm missing something and there is a kind of, more centralized space. I know the IMLR has enormous number of resources now aimed at helping us teach within universities. Do we have a space there for connections with schools? And I'm not sure. So, just a query in case I'm missing something.
Well, I think this is something, I mean, the question of fragmentation and the question of how we bring things together in a way that can act upon both the present and the future, and indeed very much upon the school sector, is something that we very much need to bring together. And I think that is increasingly part of the role of the IMLR and indeed AMLUK within that. Any other points?
No. I'm going to say this is one of the reasons why we created Filter with the support of Roots into Languages, because we wanted to create share resources and have these materials available for teachers interested, and also for them to decide which areas they wanted to develop. So in Filter, in the association, we have groups called GCSE, primary education, French, Spanish, Latin American studies, and so on. Obviously, a community of practice has to focus on an area. In this case, is the use of film, audiovisual media in language teaching. And again, we want it to be a multilingual area. We want it not only for the UK, we want it for the whole world. And that's why it's great to see now that we have teachers from China to India, to South Africa, to Italy. So this is one area, but obviously everything together, I don't know. We have, as they are writing in the chat, there are different places, like Roots into Languages, and like learning through languages. And also it's very important that these resources are open and available and free, so that the teachers don't have to pay for them.
Thank you. Just on the subject of AMLUK, this is the forum in which we are at the moment. It is the, well, I wonder if Charles or Janice would like to say a couple of words about the original intentions of AMLUK.
I'm happy to, Charles, if that helps. I think it actually came about really, I know certainly I became involved around the start of my fellowship, which was around about 2016. It came about actually when certain departments were coming under pressure, and the learned societies, of which there are very, very many, were voicing concern, and there was a view across the piece really that we needed to act really with a united front, and essentially we set up AMLUK as an informal, you know, there were no minutes, no particular agendas, no, you know, it was a loose informal grouping of the heads of lots of different learned societies. But it grew then from being the mainstream ones into all the sort of, I suppose, the traditional ones in modern languages space, into also then bringing in area studies and bringing in linguistics. And I think we kept it in that fairly informal type of grouping, as an informal type of grouping. But a firm decision, as you mentioned earlier, was taken then to apply for status as a special interest group within UCML. So it was originally, I suppose, conceived of as I suppose, partly lobbying, partly for information flow across all the areas working within the modern languages space. But it has grown from that now, and today's symposium really is indicative of that, you know, of a much more, I suppose, focused and broader and in a way more intellectual discussion across the areas. So it has grown from a sort of lobbying start, if you like.
Thank you. I mean, and our business is not to trespass on the territory of the University Council for Modern Languages, whose role is absolutely fundamental. It is to support the work of the University Council for Modern Languages and the British Academy as well. I mean, there is perhaps space to be thinking about whether we might think about the momentum that we have for events like this, and whether we want to see ourselves come more powerfully together. I know that was part of your thinking, was it not, Charles, in thinking about a version of the MLA?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. You know, today has been excellent because in many ways it's demonstrating what we've hoped for a while through the work of AMLUK. It began a long time ago, initially through a group called the Standing Council of Heads of Modern Languages Associations, which was very limited, really, to the handful of modern languages societies. Then, as Janice has said, we opened up more broadly. And what we were seeking was the sort of forum we've had today in many ways, where we can talk about methodology, where we can talk about research, where we can talk about pedagogy. So I'm very encouraged by the discussions today. I'm also pleased to see in the chat suggestions of other groups who could be brought under this umbrella in an attempt to not to offer unanimity, not to sort of homogenize our natural eclecticism and difference, but to show that there's a common direction of travel across modern languages, linguistics, and area studies. So thank you very much to the IMLR for hosting today. Thanks to all the and I think the long aim, as you say, Charles, is to have something which is the equivalent of, in some ways, the MLA in the States, which is really a very strong example of the way in which we can maintain different sections, we can maintain a distinctiveness, but nevertheless there is that federation of the various parts of our subject fields, which together are much stronger.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that is very much the point of what we're aiming towards, but to do that, we need, of course, to be as inclusive as possible in all sections of the wide field that we represent. We certainly are living in times where this kind of work and picking up on the direction of travel, and indeed making people's lives easier by avoiding a certain amount of duplication that occurs at subject association level, is absolutely imperative. I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to leave the last word to Gordula, who is the person behind the organisation of this event today, and just to thank all of our speakers and participants.
Really just to say thank you again. Thank you to all the speakers, but also to everyone who joined in the discussion. It was a brilliant, lively day, and I've certainly come out with a lot of agenda points to follow up in future work. So thanks very much, and I do hope this will become at least an annual workshop event.